The snow came down like ash over a city that had already forgotten how to feel anything. 3 days after giving birth, Isabella De Luca Moretti lay in the master bedroom of the Moretti estate, her body still torn from labor, her daughter sleeping in a bassinet 2 feet away. She had no idea that downstairs the man she married was signing her death warrant. She had no idea that by morning she would be nothing. She had no idea that by the end of the week, the family that threw her into the cold would be begging her for mercy, and she would have none left to give. If this story hits you hard, drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches. Now stay with me, because this is where it all begins. The estate sat on 12 acres of private land outside the city, surrounded by iron gates and evergreens that had been planted before Vincenzo Moretti was born. It was the kind of property that didn't appear on any public record, the kind where the driveway was long enough that you couldn't hear screaming from the road. Tonight the snow was coming down heavy, packing into drifts against the stone walls, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees since sundown. The forecasters were calling it the worst storm of the decade. Isabella had been awake since 3 in the morning. Not because of the baby, Lucia had been sleeping in 4-hour stretches, which the nurse said was remarkable for a newborn, but because of the voices downstairs. Low voices, careful voices, the kind people used when they were deciding something they didn't want overheard. She sat up in bed and immediately regretted it. The pain in her lower body was the kind that had no clean description, a tearing ache that went bone deep, and the medication the private doctor had left was on the nightstand, but she didn't reach for it. She wanted her head clear. She'd wanted her head clear since she'd heard the first voice, a woman's voice, drifting up through the heating vents sometime after midnight, Carla Benedetti's voice. Isabella knew it the way you knew a smell that had always made you sick. She eased herself to the edge of the bed. Her feet found the floor. The room was dim, one lamp burning on the far wall, and the bassinet sat between her and the window where the snow was stacking up against the glass. Lucia was on her back, one fist curled against her cheek, breathing in that shallow, rapid way newborns breathed that had terrified Isabella the first night, and now she understood was just how they were, small and fast and trusting everything around them to hold. Isabella stood. Her legs were unsteady. She grabbed the bedpost and breathed through it, 2 counts in, 4 counts out, the way she'd taught herself to breathe through things she couldn't control. Then she crossed to the door and pressed her ear against the wood. Downstairs, the voices had moved into the main hall. She could hear her husband's now, that low, deliberate cadence he used when he was in command of a room. Vincenzo Moretti did not raise his voice. He never had to. He was 41 years old, second-generation mafia, and he had built the Moretti organization from a mid-tier crime family into one of the most feared operations on the eastern seaboard. He had done it through precision, through patience, through an absolute intolerance for weakness. Through the door, his words came in fragments. Enough. Done. She knew. Then Carla's voice, smooth and close and certain of itself. I told you months ago. Isabella stepped back from the door. She stood in the center of the bedroom with the lamp throwing her shadow long against the wall, and she thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. She was 26 years old. She had been married to Vincenzo Moretti for 3 years, 2 of which she had spent building a life inside this organization, learning names, learning structures, learning the architecture of loyalty and threat that held the Moretti family together. She had been useful to him. She had been careful. She had believed, not because she was naive, but because she had watched him closely and he had given her reasons to believe that she had a place here. 3 days ago, she had given birth to his daughter on the 2nd floor of this house, in the room with the blue drapes he had chosen himself, attended by a private physician and 2 nurses who had signed non-disclosure agreements. He had held Lucia for approximately 4 minutes before handing her back and taking a phone call. Isabella had not spoken to him for more than 5 minutes at a time since. She went to the bassinet. She picked up Lucia very carefully, the way the nurse had shown her, supporting the head, keeping the body against her chest. And the baby stirred but didn't wake. Isabella stood by the window with her daughter against her and looked out at the snow. The grounds were white. The gates at the end of the drive were barely visible. The single security light over the garage swung slightly in the wind, casting moving shadows across the drifts. She heard footsteps on the stairs. More than one set. She turned from the window and faced the door, and she did not back up. Vincenzo came in first. He was dressed like he'd never gone to bed, charcoal suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt open. And behind him came two of his men, Marco and a newer one she'd only seen twice, whose name she didn't know. Carla Benedetti came in last and positioned herself near the wall like she'd been doing this her whole life, which Isabella suspected she had. Carla was 34, dark-haired, and had been Vincenzo's mistress for 2 years before the marriage, and Isabella now understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its completeness during it as well. She was wearing a silk blouse and slacks, and she looked at Isabella with the particular expression of a woman who had won something she'd been waiting a long time for. Vincenzo looked at his wife holding their daughter, and his expression did not change. "You need to get dressed," he said. Isabella looked at him. "It's 4 a.m. I know what time it is." "Vincenzo," she kept her voice level. "I'm 3 days postpartum. I'm standing here holding your daughter, whatever you think I've done." "I don't think." He said it the same way he said everything, without heat. "I know. Castellano's people pulled a name out of one of our couriers 2 weeks ago. That name led back to this house. It led back to you." The Castellano organization, their primary rival on the north side, a family with federal connections and a habit of flipping Moretti soldiers for information. She'd heard Vincenzo talk about them for 3 years, and she'd never had a conversation with a single one of their people in her life. "That's not possible," she said. The courier gave a description, he said. "Your description." He gave a location. He gave a timeline that puts you in a meeting you weren't supposed to know about. "You want to tell me how that works?" She looked at Carla. Carla looked back at her and did not look away. "Ask her," Isabella said. Vincenzo's jaw moved once. "This isn't about her." "Isn't it?" Not a question. "Get dressed." "Where are you taking my daughter?" The silence that followed was approximately 2 seconds long, and it told her everything she needed to know about what kind of night this was going to be. Marco shifted his weight near the door. The other man was watching the floor. Vincenzo looked at her with those flat gray eyes and said, "The baby stays here." Isabella understood then that she was going to have to fight. Not argue, not negotiate. Fight. She was 3 days out of a delivery that had taken 16 hours. She was in a bedroom with 2 armed men and the man who owned them, and her daughter was in her arms, and she was going to have to fight anyway because the only other option was walking out of this room without her child, and she already knew she would not survive that. "You touch her," Isabella said quietly, "and I will burn every piece of leverage I have left, every name I know, every account, every arrangement you've made in the last 3 years that I watched you make. I know things about this organization that Carla will never know because she was never in the room when it mattered." Vincenzo said nothing. "I know who you pay in the federal building on 5th. I know what's in the warehouse on the south lot that doesn't appear on any inventory. I know why Renzo Falco went to ground 8 months ago and why you didn't look for him. I know things that would take your whole organization apart at the seams, and I will use every last one of them if you walk out of this room with my daughter." It was a gamble. She knew it was a gamble. The gamble was that he still valued containment over punishment, that even now, even at 4 a.m. with Carla watching from the wall, he would weigh the operational risk of a disgruntled former wife against the cleaner option of just removing her. She watched his face for the calculation, and she saw it happen, the slight shift behind his eyes. "Pack what you can carry," he said. "The baby goes with you." It was not mercy. She understood that. It was math. They gave her 7 minutes. She packed with one hand, Lucia in the crook of her other arm, moving through the closet with a systematic efficiency she'd learned from years of watching how Moretti men handled crisis. Nothing sentimental, nothing heavy. 2 changes of clothes, the warmth layers from the shelf above the winter coats, the small kit she'd assembled under the bathroom sink 3 months ago when she'd started feeling, without any specific cause she could name, that she might need to leave quickly one day. Cash. $4,000 in small bills. 2 prepaid phones still in their packaging. The documents she'd folded into a waterproof sleeve and kept behind the spare towels. Her original identification, the documentation from the hospital for Lucia's birth, and one other document, a letter that had arrived 6 weeks ago from an attorney she had never heard of, that she had read 3 times and then placed in the sleeve without telling anyone about it. Marco knocked on the door at the 7-minute mark. She came out with the bag over one shoulder and her daughter against her chest, and she walked past Carla Benedetti close enough to smell her perfume, and she did not look at her. She walked down the stairs and through the house she had lived in for 3 years, and she noted without sentiment the things she was leaving behind. The kitchen she had learned to use in the first year, the study where she had sat across from Vincenzo and watched him work, the room off the back hall where Lucia's furniture had been assembled 3 weeks ago, with the crib and the pale yellow paint and the small lamp shaped like a moon. She walked out the front door into the snow. It hit her like a wall. The cold was the kind that didn't feel cold immediately. It felt like pressure, like something sitting on your chest. And then 2 seconds later, the temperature registered and she hunched over Lucia instinctively, turning her back to the wind. The driveway stretched out in front of her, unlit except for the security lamp, and at the end of it, the gate was open. Behind her, she heard the front door close. She stood at the top of the steps for a moment. The snow was coming down sideways now, driven by a wind off the north, and it was packing against her legs through the thin fabric of her sweatpants, and she thought, very clearly, that she needed to move because standing still in this temperature with a newborn was not an option. She started down the driveway. She made it approximately 40 feet before she understood that they hadn't called her a car. She stopped and looked back at the house. The lights were still on in the upper windows, Carla's silhouette visible for a moment against the glass. And then she looked at the gate at the end of the drive, and beyond it the road, which was not plowed and showed no tire tracks in either direction. They'd thrown her out into a snowstorm with a newborn and no transportation. She walked faster. The gate was wrought iron and it swung shut behind her automatically as she passed through. The road beyond was a 2-lane county highway that ran between the estate and the nearest town, which was 6 miles east. She knew this because she'd driven it, in summer, in a climate-controlled car. She had never walked it. She stood on the shoulder in snow up to her ankle with her daughter against her chest, and she assessed. The temperature was below 20. The snow was reducing visibility to something under 100 yards. She was wearing a winter coat, but her legs were inadequately covered, and her feet were in the boots she'd grabbed from just inside the closet door, which were lined but not insulated. She had $4,000 in cash and a newborn and a lawyer's letter she hadn't told anyone about, and she had maybe 90 minutes before her extremities started becoming a problem. She started walking east. Lucia stayed quiet. That was what Isabella would remember later, that the baby didn't cry, not once, the whole time they walked, as if she understood that crying would cost them something they couldn't afford. Isabella tucked her deeper inside the coat, held her with both arms, and walked with her head down against the wind. The cold found the gaps in her collar and the unprotected skin of her neck and face, and she kept walking. The road was flat, and the snowfall muffled everything so that the only sounds were her own breathing and the wind and the faint creak of her boots in the packed snow. She counted her steps because it was something to do. At around the 400 mark, headlights appeared behind her. She didn't stop walking. She didn't look back. If it was one of Vincenzo's men coming to reconsider the options, she had no play. She was on an empty road in a blizzard with a 3-day-old infant, and there was nothing she could do about it. If it wasn't, she'd figure that out when she figured it out. She kept walking. The vehicle slowed beside her, a black SUV, the kind of weight and tint that cost money. The passenger window came down. Isabella De Luca. She stopped. Not Isabella Moretti. Not Mrs. Moretti. Not Isabella. Isabella De Luca. She turned and looked at the man in the passenger seat. He was in his 50s, heavy-set, with a face that had seen weather and hard decisions, and was not particularly troubled by either. He was wearing a dark overcoat, and he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read in the dark. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he said, "but your grandfather knew my father for 40 years. My name is Enzo Caruso. I work for the De Luca Syndicate. I've been in this county for 6 days waiting for a moment to make contact." Isabella stood in the snow and looked at him, and the wind drove ice crystals against her face, and she did not move. "Get in the car," he said. "You and the baby, please." She had, in the last 2 hours, been accused of betrayal by her husband, walked out of her house into a blizzard, and faced the real possibility that she and her newborn daughter would be dead by morning. She had no reason to trust this man. She had no reason to trust anyone. She looked at him, and she looked at the empty road ahead of her, and she thought about the letter in the waterproof sleeve against her chest, the letter from an attorney named Benedictus Romano that had arrived 6 weeks ago and that she had read 3 times without knowing what to do with it. The letter had said, "You are the last living heir of Don Salvatore De Luca. He is dying. He wants you found before the end. There are things that need to transfer to you before they can transfer to anyone else." She had thought at the time that it was a mistake, a fraud, something designed to extract information or money or leverage from someone who happened to share a name. She looked at Enzo Caruso in the black SUV in the snow. "How did you find me tonight?" she said. "We've had eyes on the estate for 4 days," he said. "We saw what they did. We were waiting to see if you'd make it to the road. You were watching. We needed to know," he said, "that you could move. We can't use someone who can't move." It was a strange thing to say to a woman who had just walked 400 yards in a blizzard with a newborn. She understood it anyway. He wasn't apologizing for waiting. He was telling her that he had watched her demonstrate something, and that she had demonstrated it, and that this was why the car had pulled over. She got in. The interior was warm. That was the first thing. The heat that came up from the floor vents and hit her legs, and she hadn't understood until that moment how close she'd been to not being able to feel them anymore. She settled into the back seat, Lucia still against her chest, and a woman who'd been sitting in the far corner handed her a blanket without comment, and she wrapped it around both of them. Enzo Caruso turned in the passenger seat and looked at her. "How is the child?" he said. "She's fine." Isabella pulled back the edge of the coat, enough to confirm this, and Lucia's eyes were open now, dark and unfocused and calm, looking at nothing. "She's fine." "Good." He turned back to face the road. The driver had already pulled back onto the highway, heading east. "There's a lot to tell you. We'll do it somewhere warm." "You said you work for the De Luca Syndicate," she said. "That's right." "My mother's family." "Your grandfather's organization." He paused. "Don Salvatore passed 4 days ago. The formal transfer of authority was initiated 2 weeks before his death. The legal documentation is already filed. The assets are already titled. It was done very carefully and very quietly, specifically to avoid interference from certain parties who had expectations about the succession. The car moved through the snow. Isabella looked out the window at the white fields and the dark tree lines going past, and she held her daughter, and she said nothing for a moment. "What parties?" she said. "There are men who believe they were next in line," Caruso said. "Men who have been with the syndicate for 30 years and who believe that loyalty to Don Salvatore would translate into inheritance. They were wrong. Your grandfather had his reasons. He was a man who believed that blood was the only thing that didn't lie." "He didn't know me," she said. "I've never met him." "No," Caruso said, "but he knew your mother, and he spent 12 years watching you from a distance. He had people watching. He had reports." A pause. "He knew what you were before you knew it yourself." She sat with that. The heat in the car was working its way up through her now, and the pain in her body was coming back with it, the kind of pain that numbness had been quietly holding at bay. She shifted and breathed through it. "What am I inheriting?" she said. It was not really a question. She'd read the letter. She had a rough idea. "Everything," Caruso said. "The syndicate operations in 4 states, 14 legitimate businesses that serve as primary income vehicles, real estate holdings in 3 countries, accounts that have been accumulating for 40 years. He turned again to look at her directly. "And the loyalty of every captain and soldier in the De Luca organization, which is currently 340 men, all of whom have been briefed that this transfer is happening." Isabella looked at him. "All of them?" "Salvatore's final order," he said. "He gave it 2 months before he passed. He told them who you were, and he told them that when it was done, you would be their authority. Not a figurehead, not a front, the actual head of the syndicate." "He didn't ask me." "No," Caruso said. "He didn't." She looked out the window again. They were passing the outskirts of a small town now, streetlights going by in intervals, a gas station closed for the night with snow banked against the pumps. Why the DeLuca name? She said. When I married Vincenzo, I took the Moretti name. How did you find me as... You were born Isabella DeLuca, Caruso said. Whatever name you've been using, that's what you are. That's what the documents reflect. That's what your grandfather insisted on maintaining in every record that mattered to him. She thought about Vincenzo saying her description. The courier gave your description, a timeline that puts you in a meeting you weren't supposed to know about. She thought about Carla Benedetti standing against the wall in her silk blouse with that expression of patient victory. She thought about a woman who had been waiting 2 years to be rid of a wife, who had access to whatever information she needed to construct a case, who had been positioned inside the organization long enough to know what a usable betrayal looked like. The Moretti family thinks I sold them out to the Castellano organization, she said. Yes, Caruso said. Did you know about this? A slight hesitation. We knew it was being arranged. We didn't know the timeline. She looked at him. We needed you outside the estate, he said, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who was not going to apologize for the math, but also wasn't particularly comfortable with how it sounded out loud. Don Salvatore's people could not extract you from inside Moretti property without triggering a war we weren't ready for. We needed you to come out. The car was very quiet for a moment. You needed me to get thrown out in a blizzard, she said. We needed you outside, he said again. We didn't know it would be a blizzard. We didn't know about the baby's condition. We didn't know how recently you delivered. If we had known the specifics, you still would have waited, she said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Isabella looked at her daughter's face in the blanket against her chest. Lucia's eyes had closed again. Her breath was steady, that fast, shallow rhythm, and Isabella counted 5 breaths and then looked up at the road ahead. All right, she said. Caruso turned slightly. All right, she said again. Tell me everything. They drove for another hour and a half, east and then south, the storm tracking with them but losing some of its intensity as they moved away from the coast. Caruso talked in his methodical, careful way, and the woman in the corner, who he eventually introduced as Vera, the syndicate's head of operations for the northeastern region, a small woman in her late 40s with gray-streaked hair and eyes that missed very little, filled in the structural details. The DeLuca syndicate had been operating for 50 years. Salvatore DeLuca had built it from nothing after arriving from the south with $40 and a name that meant nothing to anyone. He had spent 30 years making it mean something. The organization was cleaner than most, not out of morality, but out of strategy. Salvatore had understood early that the crime families who survived were the ones who kept their exposure contained, who maintained legitimate cover that could withstand scrutiny, who never got greedy enough to draw the kind of attention that couldn't be managed. He had one vulnerability, Vera said. Her voice was precise and a little dry, the voice of someone who had been briefing people on operational details for a long time. His daughter, your mother. She died when I was 4, Isabella said. She died because of choices she made, Vera said, not unkindly. She fell in love with a man outside the organization, your father. Salvatore opposed it. They cut contact. Your mother tried to keep you outside the life entirely. She succeeded, Isabella said, until she didn't. You married Vincenzo Moretti, Vera said. I didn't know what he was when I met him. This was the truth, and it was also, 3 years later, a more complicated truth than it sounded. She had learned what he was. She had stayed. She had told herself that she was navigating it, managing it, that she was not complicit. She had told herself a lot of things. Salvatore knew, Vera said. He monitored the situation. He believed, perhaps incorrectly, we can debate it, that your time inside the Moretti organization was not wasted, that you were learning things he would have taught you himself if you'd known each other. Isabella thought about the last 3 years, the meetings she had absorbed, the conversations she had memorized without meaning to. The structure of the Moretti operation mapped out in her head like a floor plan she'd walked until she knew every room. She had not been learning it to use it. She had just been paying attention because paying attention was how she'd always survived. But the result was the same. He wasn't wrong, she said. The safe house was a converted farmhouse 40 miles from the estate, set back from a rural highway behind a windbreak of pines. There were 4 men outside when the SUV pulled up, and they stood in the snow with their hands visible and their attention everywhere. And when Caruso got out, they acknowledged him with the particular economy of men who communicated mostly in nods and positions. Inside, the house was warm and functionally furnished and smelled like coffee and wood smoke. There was a room prepared at the back, a bed, a side table, a lamp, and a small setup for the baby that someone had arranged with a care that surprised her, a lined box that would serve as a bassinet, 2 blankets, a package of newborn diapers still in their bag. She stood in the doorway of this room and looked at it, and something in her chest moved that she did not have the space to examine right now. A woman came in, introduced as Marta, the house's resident medic, and without ceremony asked Isabella to sit down and began checking her over with brisk efficiency. Blood pressure, temperature, the surgical site from the delivery. Marta had the manner of someone who had treated injuries she hadn't asked about and understood that questions were less useful than competence. "You're okay," she said when she was done. "You're going to hurt for another week at minimum. Don't do anything stupid." "Define stupid," Isabella said. Marta looked at her for a moment. "Anything that requires moving faster than you currently can. I'll keep that in mind." She slept for 4 hours. She woke to Lucia crying, the first real crying the baby had done, a sound that went straight through Isabella's chest and got her upright before she was fully conscious. And she fed her and held her, and sat in the chair beside the makeshift bassinet in the gray early light coming through the frosted window, and she thought. She thought about Carla Benedetti's face. She thought about the structure of the Moretti organization, the way it was held together, the pressure points and the soft spots. She thought about what 3 years of watching a mafia operation function looked like when you processed it not as a wife in a house, but as someone who needed to understand it as a system that could be broken. She thought about the accounts and the connections and the names and the arrangements that were supposed to be secret and were not secret to her. She thought about what Vincenzo Moretti would do when he discovered that the woman he'd thrown out into a snowstorm was not dead. She thought about what it meant that she was sitting in a safe house belonging to an organization that now, legally and formally, was hers. Caruso was in the main room when she came out. He was at the table with Vera and 2 men she hadn't seen before, and there were papers spread out and a laptop open and coffee going cold in 4 cups. He looked up when she came in with Lucia, and whatever he saw on her face made him sit back slightly. "I have questions," she said. "I expected you would," he said. She sat down at the table. Vera turned the laptop so Isabella could see the screen. A financial summary, columns of figures, and at the top a legal header with her name on it, Isabella De Luca. She had not seen her name written that way in 3 years. "Talk to me about the Moretti family's exposure," she said. "Not what I know. What you know. I want to understand where the gaps are." Caruso and Vera exchanged a look. "The Moretti operation has 3 primary vulnerabilities," Vera said. "First, their relationship with the Alderton political machine. They've been laundering money through Alderton's campaign infrastructure for 8 years, and the paper trail, while carefully constructed, exists. Second, the arms arrangement with the Sever Group, which is an Eastern European organization with federal attention currently on them that could redirect at any time. Third," she paused, "Carla Benedetti." Isabella looked at her. "She's been running an independent operation inside the Moretti family for 18 months, Vera said, using Moretti resources for her own benefit. The frame she constructed against you was partly designed to eliminate a threat to her position and partly to prevent Vincenzo from ever discovering what she's been doing." "What has she been doing?" Isabella said. "Skimming, redirection of funds. She has accounts that Vincenzo doesn't know about. She's been building an exit strategy." Vera said it flatly, the way she said everything. She intended to use the Moretti organization until it stopped being useful and then disappear with what she'd accumulated. Isabella sat with that for a moment. She looked down at Lucia in her arms. "How long," she said, "before the Moretti family discovers I'm alive?" "That depends on what they sent after you," Caruso said. "Nothing," she said. "They threw me out in a storm and locked the gate. They expected the weather to handle it." "Then you have time," Vera said. "They won't be looking for a body before the storm clears. That's another day minimum, possibly 2. "I need a week," Isabella said. The room was quiet for a moment. "A week for what?" Caruso said. "To understand what I have." She looked at the papers on the table, the laptop screen, the faces of the men she hadn't been introduced to yet. I've just inherited an organization I don't know. I know the Moretti operation better than anything, but that's only useful if I understand what I'm working with on this side. I need a week to learn the syndicate before I decide anything about the Moretti family. Caruso looked at her for a long moment. Salvatore spent 30 years building this, he said. It was not a warning. It was context. He was telling her the weight of what she was holding. I know, she said. He chose you, Caruso said. But choosing and being ready are two different things. I know that too, she said. That's why I'm asking for a week, not an hour. Something in his face shifted. Not respect exactly, more like the recognition of a familiar quality, the quality of a person who knew the difference between what they had and what they needed. A week, he said. She spent that week the way she'd spent 3 years watching Vincenzo work, with everything she had. The syndicate captains came in pairs and threes, men who had been with the organization for decades, and they sat across from her in the farmhouse, and they looked at her with varying degrees of skepticism, and she asked them questions about operations, about logistics, about personnel, about the specific texture of how the syndicate functioned in each of its territories. She listened more than she talked. She took nothing for granted. She also read everything. The financial summaries, the organizational charts, the history Vera had assembled of every major Moretti operation and how it intersected with DeLuca territory. She read the documentation on the Alderton connection, on the Saver Arms arrangement, on the accounts she recognized from Vincenzo's study and the accounts she'd never seen before. She read the files Vera had on Carla Benedetti, 18 months of transactions, redirections, quietly accumulated evidence of a woman who had been pillaging an organization she was sleeping her way into. On the 5th day, she called Vera into the back room. There's a meeting next Friday, she said. The Moretti family. They do a quarterly review with their captains and their primary business partners. I know the location and the format because I attended 2 of them. Vera sat down. I want to be there, Isabella said. That's not possible for another month at minimum, Vera said. You're 3 days past 9 days, Isabella said. I'll be 12 days postpartum by then. That's enough. Medically, I'm not asking for a medical opinion, Isabella said. I'm asking if it's logistically possible to place me in that room without alerting the Moretti family in advance. Vera was quiet for a moment. Not in that room, but adjacent to it, she thought. There's a floor above the meeting space. It's a private club. The Moretti family has a standing reservation of the 3rd floor dining room for these reviews. The 4th floor is accessible. I don't want to observe, Isabella said. I want to be in the room. Then we need more time. Isabella looked at the wall for a moment. She thought about Lucia in the next room, asleep, 9 days old and unaware of anything. She thought about Carla Benedetti in the master bedroom of the estate, probably already redecorating. Fine, she said. More time. She looked at Vera. But I want everything ready. Every piece of leverage we have on the Moretti operation. I want it documented, verified, and ready to deploy. I want the Alderton connection documented in detail. I want the Seaver arrangement laid out completely. I want Carla Benedetti's accounts with full transaction histories. That's several weeks of work, Vera said. Then start tonight, Isabella said. She went back to the room where Lucia was sleeping. She sat in the chair. She looked at her daughter's face, the small details of it, the particular shape of her nose that came from somewhere Isabella couldn't place, maybe from a grandfather she'd never met. She thought about Don Salvatore De Luca, who had watched her from a distance for 12 years without ever introducing himself. She thought about what kind of man did that, what kind of calculation held him back from reaching out to his own blood. She thought about what he had built and what he had decided it was worth, in the end, and who he had decided it should go to. She thought about what it meant that he had been right. Outside, the storm had finally stopped. The night was clear and very cold, the sky full of stars over the snow-covered fields, and somewhere out there a city was waking up to find the world quieter and whiter than it had been the night before. Somewhere in that city, Vincenzo Moretti was sleeping next to Carla Benedetti, and believing, as he always believed everything, with complete confidence, that the problem he'd disposed of was disposed of. He had no idea what he had thrown away. He had no idea that the woman he'd left to die in the snow was, at this moment, sitting in a chair in a farmhouse that belonged to an organization that dwarfed his own, holding his daughter, and thinking about all the ways his entire empire could be taken apart at the seams. He had no idea that Carla Benedetti, the woman he'd chosen over his wife, the woman he'd trusted to stand in the room while he signed his wife's death warrant, had been stealing from him for 18 months. He had no idea about any of it. He would, Isabella thought. Not yet. But he would. She looked at Lucia's face and she thought, I will build something worth having, something worth passing on, something that nobody will ever be able to take from you the way they tried to take it from me. The stars were sharp and cold outside the window. Somewhere across the county, a black SUV sat in the parking lot of a diner that had just opened for the early shift, engine running, and inside it 2 of Caruso's men drank coffee and watched the road in both directions. They were watching for a specific vehicle, a silver Mercedes registered to a shell company that was registered to another shell company that ultimately traced back to an account the Moretti family used for discreet removal operations. They had been watching all night. At 6:14 in the morning, the silver Mercedes turned onto the road from the east. The man in the passenger seat of the SUV picked up his phone and dialed a number. In the farmhouse, Vera's phone buzzed on the table beside the papers. She picked it up, listened for 4 seconds, and said, "Understood." She walked to the back of the house and knocked on Isabella's door. "They sent someone," she said through the door. Inside the room, Isabella had already heard the knock in the way of someone who had not actually been sleeping. She was on her feet, Lucia in her arms, and she said, "How many?" "1 vehicle," Vera said. "We don't know how many inside yet." "Then we move," Isabella said, and her voice was flat and certain, the voice of someone who had made a decision somewhere in the hours before dawn and was now simply executing it. She was already moving toward the door when she stopped. She looked back at the room, at the makeshift bassinet with its folded blankets, at the lamp someone had left on low, at the waterproof sleeve on the bedside table that she picked up and tucked into her coat without breaking stride. She opened the door. Whatever was coming up that road, she was done running from it. The silver Mercedes was doing 40 on a road that called for 30, which meant whoever was driving it was either confident or careless, and in Isabella's experience, those 2 things produced the same result. Vera had her by the arm before she cleared the hallway, not grabbing, just a hand at her elbow, directional. "Back door. There's a vehicle in the tree line behind the property. Caruso's already outside." "How many exits does this house have?" 3. Front, back, and a cellar hatch on the east side. "Put a man on the cellar hatch." Vera looked at her for half a second. "Already done." They moved through the kitchen, which smelled of old coffee and wood smoke, and Isabella held Lucia against her chest with one arm and kept her other hand free, and she thought about what she had in her coat. The cash, the documents, the prepaid phones, nothing else. She had come out of that house with nothing that could hurt her and nothing that could help her if this went wrong, and she needed to correct that imbalance as quickly as possible. Outside, the cold hit her differently than it had the night before. Less shock. More information. The sky was clear and pale, early morning light coming flat across the snow, and the fields around the farmhouse were open and white in every direction. The tree line Vera had mentioned was 40 yards to the north, a band of pines dense enough to hide a vehicle. She could see the exhaust rising from somewhere inside it. Caruso was on the back steps. He had a phone to his ear and he was watching the south side of the property, which was the direction the road came from. "They stopped," he said, not to her, to whoever was on the phone. He listened. "How far?" He listened again. "All right." He lowered the phone. "They stopped 200 yards south," he said. "Pulled off the road, not moving." Isabella looked at the tree line. "They're waiting to see if we run. That's what I think. If we run, they follow. If we stay, we're contained," Caruso said. He said it without emotion, assessing. Isabella thought about the layout of the farmhouse, the rooms she'd been in, the rooms she hadn't, the number of men she'd seen. She thought about the Mercedes sitting 200 yards down the road and the men inside it who had been sent to confirm that a problem had been resolved, and what they would do if they confirmed it hadn't been. "How many men do we have on the property right now?" she said. "6, Caruso said. 2 more in the trees. 8 against whatever's in that car." "Probably 2, Vera said from the doorway. "Vincenzo doesn't waste manpower on confirmations. He sends 2. If 2 isn't enough, he doesn't expect them back." Isabella absorbed that. "Then we don't run," she said. Caruso turned to look at her. "We don't run," she said again. "We let them confirm." "Confirm what?" he said. "That I'm dead." She looked at him steadily. "They came to confirm a body. Give them something to confirm." The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. "That's a significant risk," Caruso said. "Everything right now is a significant risk. The question is which risk costs us more." She shifted Lucia against her chest. "If they go back to Vincenzo and tell him I was found alive and sheltered by the De Luca syndicate, he starts making calls immediately. He'll know what I've inherited before I've had time to do anything with it. We lose every advantage we have." "And if they go back and tell him you're dead?" "Then I have the time I need," she said. "Time to learn the organization, time to prepare, time to build this correctly instead of reactively." Vera said from the doorway. "What are you proposing exactly?" Isabella looked at her. "I'm proposing we give them a story, a body, or the suggestion of one, something that satisfies them enough to report back that the situation is handled." Another silence. "Marta," Caruso said. The medic appeared from inside, hands in her jacket pockets. "What do you need?" Marta said. They worked it out in 4 minutes. It was not a sophisticated deception. It didn't need to be. Vincenzo's men were coming to confirm what they already expected to be true. And people who expect something will find it if you give them even a partial shape to hang the expectation on. What they needed was evidence of a scene, a location that could be found, tracks in the snow consistent with someone who had stopped moving, some physical artifact that would satisfy a man who had been sent to check a box. What they used was the coat Isabella had been wearing when she walked out of the Moretti estate. She had changed into warmer clothes an hour after arriving at the farmhouse, and the original coat was folded on a shelf in the back room. Marta took it, and 2 of Caruso's men walked it out to the northern edge of the property, to the far side of the windbreak, where the snow was deep and the footprints from the road could be read as going in and not coming out. They arranged it deliberately, the coat half buried, face down, one sleeve extended. Then they came back. Caruso sent one man to a position where he could observe the Mercedes without being seen. They waited. At 7:03, the Mercedes moved. It came slowly up the road, past the farmhouse's visible driveway, and continued north. It stopped near the windbreak. 2 men got out. They stood in the snow for approximately 4 minutes, and then one of them walked to the tree line while the other stayed with the car. The one who walked to the trees came back after 2 minutes. They spoke briefly. They took photographs with a phone, then they got back in the car and turned around and drove south. Caruso's man called it in. Isabella was in the kitchen when Caruso came to tell her. He stood in the doorway and said, "They're gone," and she nodded and said nothing for a moment. "How long does that buy us?" she said. "Until Vincenzo decides he wants more than photographs," Caruso said. "A week, maybe 10 days if he's not paying attention to this specifically." "He won't be," she said. "He'll move on. He has a business to run." "You know him well enough to be sure of that." "I know him well enough to know that once he makes a decision, he files it and moves forward. He doesn't circle back. It's a strength and it's going to be a liability." Caruso sat down across from her. The table between them held the remains of the morning, 2 coffee cups, a file folder, the notepad she'd been using the night before. He looked at the notepad and then at her. "You've been making a list," he said. "Names," she said. "Things I know about the Moretti organization that aren't in your files." He looked at her steadily. "How much is there?" "Enough," she said. "Vincenzo trusted me with more than he should have. Not because he was careless, because he thought I had nowhere to go with it." She looked at the notepad. "He was right, at the time." Caruso was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Alderton connection, you knew about it?" "I was in the room when it was arranged," she said. "I know the account structure, the amount cycle. The name of the man in Alderton's finance office who processes the transfers. She paused. His name is Devin Marsh. He has a second set of books that he believes are known only to Vincenzo. They're not. I photographed them 8 months ago. Caruso went very still. Where? He said. Off-site, she said. A storage unit in the city, registered to a name that doesn't connect to me. Why? He said. Why did you do that? It was a fair question. She'd asked herself the same thing at the time. She'd told herself it was insurance, that anyone living inside a mafia operation needed insurance. But the fuller truth was that she'd known, on some level she hadn't examined closely, that the ground she was standing on was not permanent, that one day she would need something to stand on that didn't belong to Vincenzo. Because I wasn't sure how it would end, she said. Caruso sat with that for a moment. I need to go to the city, she said. The storage unit. And there are 2 other locations, a lockbox at a private bank on the west side, and a person I need to speak to in person. Who? He said. A woman named Frances Okoro. She worked as an accountant for the Moretti family's legitimate holdings for 6 years. She left 14 months ago under circumstances the official record describes as voluntary. They weren't voluntary. She looked at him. She knows things about the financial architecture of the Moretti operation that aren't written down anywhere, because she was the one who built it, and she left angry. Caruso considered this. You've been planning this. I've been preserving options, she said. Planning implies I knew what I was planning for. I didn't. But now you do. She looked at the notepad, at the list of names in her own careful handwriting, at the shape of what she was assembling piece by piece, in the back of her mind where she kept the things she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Now I do, she said. They went to the city 3 days later, when Isabella could move without the pain stopping her every 20 steps, and when Caruso was satisfied that the movement could be done without exposure. He sent 2 cars ahead to sweep the routes, and kept 2 more with the convoy, and Vera sat beside Isabella in the middle vehicle, and they went over the sequence of stops without speaking much, because they had already spoken about it enough, and both of them were the kind of people who understood that over-preparation became its own vulnerability. The storage unit was in a building that smelled like machine oil and old carpet, climate-controlled, with keycard access and no cameras in the individual corridors. Isabella had been renting the unit for 14 months under a name she'd used once and only once, and she walked to it now with a familiarity that felt strange given everything that had happened in the last 12 days. The combination lock opened on the first try. Inside, 3 file boxes, a waterproof bag containing 2 hard drives, and a smaller bag with a burner phone that was almost certainly dead and a set of keys she needed to identify. She took the bag with the hard drives. She took one of the file boxes. She left the rest. Enough? Vera said. The other boxes are backup. If something happens to us, I need something to still exist. Vera looked at the remaining boxes and said nothing. She understood the logic. The bank was a private institution on the west side of the city, the kind that didn't have a sign large enough to read from the street, and the man at the desk recognized Isabella with a professionalism that was its own form of blankness. The lockbox contained a single item, a sealed envelope with a document inside that Isabella had placed there 11 months ago and had not looked at since. She looked at it now, in the small private room off the main floor, while Vera waited in the lobby and Caruso waited outside with the car. The document was a notarized statement, witnessed by 2 people whose names she'd obtained through careful effort, describing in specific detail a meeting she had attended 8 months ago, a meeting between Vincenzo Moretti and a federal official whose name did not appear in any public connection to the Moretti organization. The statement described the meeting, the location, the attendees, the substance of what was discussed. It described the arrangement that had existed for 4 years between Vincenzo Moretti and this official, who provided early notice of federal inquiries in exchange for a monthly payment processed through the Alderton infrastructure. She read it once, confirming it was intact and correct. Then she put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the inner pocket of her coat and left. Frances Okoro lived in a 3rd-floor apartment in a neighborhood that had been declining since the mill closures, and was now in that particular state of stalled deterioration where nothing got worse, but nothing got better either. The building's elevator was broken, and the stairwell smelled of old cooking, and Isabella climbed 3 flights with Lucia in the carrier she'd had since the second day at the farmhouse, and her legs aching and her jaw set. And she knocked on the door of apartment 3C. Frances opened it on the second knock. She was a small woman, compact, mid-40s, with the look of someone who had very recently stopped being surprised by things. She looked at Isabella. She looked at the baby. She looked past Isabella at the stairwell. "Who's behind you?" Frances said. "No one dangerous to you?" Isabella said. Frances looked at her for another moment. "Come in." The apartment was small and very clean, the kind of clean that came from a person who needed control over at least one environment. There were books on every surface, and a desk in the corner covered in papers, and a window overlooking the street that Frances moved to check before she said anything. "You look like you've had a difficult couple of weeks," Frances said. "I have," Isabella said. "I want to talk to you about the Moretti accounts." Frances turned from the window. "I don't work for them anymore." "I know. I want to talk to you about what they did to you when you left." A pause. Something shifted in Frances's face, not opening exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a person who has been carrying something and just heard someone else name it. "How do you know about that?" Frances said. "Because I was in that house," Isabella said. "I saw things." "You're his wife." "I was," Isabella said. "They threw me out 12 days ago, 3 days after I had my daughter." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm not asking you to trust me because of that. I'm asking you to listen to what I have to offer." Frances sat down in the chair by the desk. She didn't invite Isabella to sit, but she didn't tell her to stand either, so Isabella sat on the edge of the small sofa and shifted Lucia in the carrier and waited. "What do you have to offer?" Frances said. "Documentation," Isabella said, "of what they took from you, how they moved it, where it is now." Frances's hands on the armrests of the chair went very still. "And in exchange," Frances said, "your knowledge of the account architecture, not what you can remember from when you built it, what you know it looks like now, because I know you've been watching it. You left angry, and you're a person who pays attention to things, and I know you've been tracking what they've done with the structure since you left." She looked at her. "I'm right, aren't I?" Frances said nothing for a moment. "Yes," she said. They talked for 2 hours. Frances was methodical and precise, and she had indeed been watching, with the focused obsession of a person who had been wronged and couldn't let go of the specifics of how. She knew the current account structure of the Moretti financial operation in more detail than Isabella had hoped, and she had documented it with the instincts of an accountant who understood that documentation was the only thing that outlasted memory. By the time they were done, Isabella had 3 additional pieces of information she hadn't had when she walked in, and Frances had agreed. Not warmly, not enthusiastically, but with the particular resolve of someone who had finally found a direction for their anger, to prepare a formal analysis of the Moretti accounts that could be used as operational intelligence. "One question," Frances said at the door. "Go ahead," Isabella said. "What are you going to do with all of this?" Isabella looked at her. She thought about the list of names in the farmhouse, the file boxes in the storage unit, the document in her coat pocket, the 2 hard drives in the bag Caruso was holding in the car downstairs. She thought about 340 men who had been told by their dying dawn that this woman, this person who had grown up outside the life and married the wrong man and been thrown out in a snowstorm, was now their authority. "What needs to be done?" Isabella said. Frances held her gaze for a moment. Then she stepped back and closed the door. In the car on the way back, Vera looked at Isabella and said, "The meeting at the farm tomorrow. The captains who haven't come in yet, Ricci and the brothers from the South Territory, they've been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About your fitness," Vera said. It was a flat word. She didn't dress it up. "They want to know if I can run this," Isabella said. "They want to know if you're a liability," Vera said. "There's a difference. A person who can't run an organization can still be installed as a figurehead. A liability brings the organization down." "They think I'm a liability because Vincenzo knows my face," Isabella said, "and because you have a newborn, and because you have no operational history." Vera looked out the window. Ricci in particular. He's been with the syndicate for 22 years. He knew your grandfather. Does he respect the transfer of authority? He respects Salvatore, Vera said. That's not the same as respecting the transfer. Isabella thought about this for the rest of the drive. She thought about what it meant to walk into a room full of men who had been loyal to a man they respected and be the person that man had chosen over all of them. She thought about what they would need to see and what she had to show them. Ricci came to the farmhouse the next evening with the Carbone brothers from the south, two men in their late 40s who were polite and watchful and communicated mainly by exchanging glances that Isabella read like text. They sat across the table from her in the main room, and Caruso stood in the corner, and Vera sat at the end, and there was coffee, and no one touched it. Ricci was a large man, not tall, but wide, with hands that looked like they'd been used for heavy work for a long time. He had a face that went with those hands, worn down to something that didn't give much away. He looked at Isabella the way she imagined he looked at everything, like it might need to be moved. "You're 26, he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "You were inside the Moretti organization for 3 years." "Yes." "And now you're here." He sat back. "Salvatore made his decision. I'm not arguing his right to make it. I'm asking you to make the case." "I don't make cases," she said. He raised an eyebrow, just barely. "I understand why you want one," she said. "You've been here 22 years. You know this organization the way I know my own hand, and someone you never met just told you that this is who you work for now." She looked at him directly. "If I spent the next hour trying to convince you I'm worthy of that, you'd leave here more skeptical than when you came in. You'd know I was performing." He said nothing. "So I'm not going to do that," she said. "I'm going to tell you what I have, what I know, and what I intend to do with it. Then you make your own judgment." She laid it out. Not everything. She was not naive about what it meant to put everything on the table in a room you hadn't fully secured, but enough. The Alderton documentation, Francis Okoro's account analysis, the federal official, the Saver Arms arrangement, and the specific exposure it created. She told it without editorializing, without inflating what she had or minimizing what she didn't. When she was done, she stopped talking and let it sit. Ricci looked at the older Carbone brother, a look that communicated something. Then he looked back at her. "You've been building this," he said. "I've been preserving options," she said, and she didn't miss his slight reaction to the fact that she'd used the same phrase she'd used with Caruso without knowing he'd been told it. "Building implies intent. I was just paying attention." "For 3 years," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. One of his hands moved on the table, a small unconscious movement, like something settling. "The Moretti family," he said. "You're inside their structure. You know their exposure." "Better than anyone outside the family," she said. "And you intend to use it." "When the time is right," she said. "Not reactively, not quickly, correctly." Ricci looked at his coffee cup. He picked it up, finally, and drank from it, and set it back down. "There's a problem," he said. She waited. "The Moretti family has a contact in the Seaver group," he said. "That contact has been feeding information east about DeLuca territory, DeLuca operations, for at least 6 months. He looked at her. "We don't know who placed him. We don't know if it was Vincenzo directly or someone acting independently." Isabella felt something shift in her chest. Not panic, something colder. The recognition of a problem she hadn't known about. "Is the contact inside the syndicate?" she said. "That's what we don't know," Ricci said. "The information being fed east is specific enough that it's coming from someone who knows this organization." She looked at Vera. Vera's face was still. "You knew about this," Isabella said to her. "We had a suspicion," Vera said, "not a certainty." "How long have you had the suspicion?" A slight pause. 3 weeks. Isabella held that. 3 weeks, which meant before Salvatore died, which meant someone in this organization had known there was a potential leak before the transfer of authority and had not fully surfaced it. She looked at Caruso. Caruso looked back at her steadily. "We were trying to identify the source before bringing it up," he said. We didn't want to create instability before the transition was complete. And now, she said. Now, he said, you needed to know. She sat with it. A leak. Inside the DeLuca syndicate, someone feeding information to a connection in the Sever group, which ran east and connected back, 1 degree of separation, to the Moretti family. It could mean that Vincenzo would know about the transfer of authority before she was ready. It could mean the story of her death had already been questioned. It could mean that everything she had spent the last 12 days assembling was already compromised. Who knows about this room, she said. Who knows I'm here specifically tonight? The people in it, Ricci said. And Vera knew, she said. And Caruso knew. Yes, Caruso said. She looked at him. She looked at Vera. She looked at Ricci and the Carbone brothers. She thought about the architecture of trust and how quickly it caved when you pulled the wrong piece. She thought about what she would have done, in Vincenzo's position, if she discovered there was a leak in her organization, and the answer was that she would have sealed every room she could and started with the people closest to the information. We're going to move the operation, she said. We just settled in here, Vera said. I know. She looked at her. We're moving tomorrow morning, different location. I'll tell you where after we've left here. She looked at everyone at the table. I don't believe any of you are the source, but I need to operate on the assumption that someone somewhere in this organization is talking, and that means I need to stop being predictable. Ricci looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. It was a word with some weight behind it. There's one more thing, Isabella said. She reached into her coat. She pulled out the document from the lockbox, the notarized statement about the federal official. She put it on the table. That needs to go through a specific channel, she said. Not yet. But when the time comes, I need it placed correctly. She looked at Ricci. You know a man named Alderton's people call Devin Marsh? Ricci's expression shifted, just enough. I know of him. Then you know what that document represents, she said. When the time comes, it goes through you, not through anyone else. He looked at the document. He looked at her. You're trusting me with this, he said. I'm trusting the organization, she said. You're part of it. That's what the trust is built on. He picked up the document, folded it once, put it inside his jacket. When will the time come? He said. She thought about the meeting she was planning, the room she intended to walk into, the faces she intended to see when she walked through that door and took the chair at the head of the table and made the Moretti family understand what they had done. Not yet, she said. When I say. He nodded once. The meeting ended. The men left. Vera began coordinating the relocation with the efficiency of a person who had moved operations before, and Caruso stepped outside to make calls, and Isabella sat at the table alone for a moment with her daughter, in the carrier against her chest, and the lamp throwing its circle of light over the papers she was leaving behind. She thought about what Ricci had said. The leak. The Sever connection. The information going east. She thought about how someone inside the DeLuca syndicate, someone who knew enough to be dangerous, had been talking to people connected to Vincenzo Moretti for 6 months. 6 months, which overlapped with the period when Don Salvatore had been making his final arrangements, which meant someone had known the transfer was coming and had started positioning themselves before it happened. She thought about who had the most to lose from a transfer of authority to someone outside the organization's inner circle. She thought about 22 years of loyalty and the expectation it created. She thought about a man who had looked at her across a table and said, I'm not arguing his right to make it in a tone that said he was doing exactly that. She sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up the phone Caruso had given her and she dialed Vera's number. When you run the relocation tonight, she said when Vera picked up, run it in 2 groups, different routes, different timing. A pause. And Vera, don't tell Ricci the destination until the second group is already in place. A silence on the line. You think it's him, Vera said. I don't think anything yet, Isabella said. I'm just being careful. She hung up. She sat in the lamplight with her daughter against her chest, and she looked at the wall and she thought about the things she hadn't said out loud yet. The thing that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Ricci had looked at the document and put it in his jacket with just a half-second too much recognition in his face. Recognition of something he'd said he only knew of. She thought about what it meant if the man who had known Don Salvatore for 22 years, the man whose loyalty was supposed to be the bedrock of this organization's transition, was the one feeding information to a contact in the East. She thought about what it would mean for every plan she'd made. She thought about her daughter's face. The lamp on the table flickered once, briefly, in a draft from somewhere she couldn't locate, and then steadied. Somewhere outside, a car started, Vera's crew beginning the first stage of the relocation. And in the quiet that followed, Isabella heard, from a room down the hall, the unmistakable sound of a phone buzzing against a hard surface. Nobody was supposed to be in that room. Nobody was supposed to be in that room. Isabella was on her feet before the thought finished forming, moving down the hall with Lucia still in the carrier against her chest, her hand flat against the wall for balance because her legs were not fully reliable yet, and she knew it and moved anyway. The hallway was dim, one overhead bulb, the kind that buzzed faintly, and the door at the end was closed, but not latched, a thin line of light showing at the bottom edge. She stopped 2 feet from it and listened. Silence now. No more buzzing. Either the call had connected, or whoever was in there had silenced it. She put her hand on the door and pushed. The room was a small storage space that had been converted into something between a secondary office and a place to put things that didn't have a better location. There were 2 folding chairs, a metal shelving unit with file boxes, and a card table with a laptop that belonged to one of Caruso's men. Standing at the far wall with his back to her and a phone against his ear was the younger Carbone brother, Nico, she'd been told, 39 years old, the operational one of the two. He heard her and turned. The look on his face lasted approximately 1 second before he controlled it. It was a specific look, not guilt exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has been doing something they believed was invisible and has just discovered it wasn't. He lowered the phone. He did not end the call. She could hear very faintly a voice on the other end saying something she couldn't make out. "End it," she said. He looked at her. "End the call," she said. "Right now." He brought the phone down and ended it. He held it at his side and looked at her with the careful neutrality of a man trying to decide what he could still salvage from a situation. "Who were you talking to?" she said. "One of our men in the South Territory," he said. "There's a supply issue." "Don't," she said. It came out flat and final, the way Vincenzo's voice had always sounded when he was done negotiating, and she recognized distantly that she had picked that up somewhere in 3 years of watching him, and was now using it without having chosen to. "Give me the phone." His hand tightened on it, just barely. "The phone," she said. He handed it over. She looked at the screen, the last call, 31 seconds, to a number with an area code she recognized. Eastern Seaboard, not the South Territory. She looked at him. "Sit down," she said. He sat in one of the folding chairs. He was a compact man, not physically imposing, with the kind of forgettable face that was probably useful in his line of work. His older brother Dante had done most of the talking at the meeting, which she now understood was because Nico's role was not to be noticed. She stood in front of him with the phone in her hand and her daughter against her chest, and she thought about what the next 5 minutes needed to accomplish. "How long?" she said. He said nothing. "How long have you been passing information east?" He pressed his lips together. "I have the call log on this phone," she said. "I have people who can pull location data off it in about 30 minutes. I have—" She stopped. She didn't need to inventory everything she had. She needed him to talk, and the best way to get him to talk was to let him understand that talking was the only version of this where he walked out of the building. "You have one opportunity to make this useful. I'm giving it to you now." His jaw moved. 6 months, he said. She had known it was 6 months. Ricci had said 6 months, but hearing it confirmed out loud did something specific to the temperature in her chest. "Who approached who?" she said. "They approached us." He glanced at the door. "Me and Dante." "Dante knows." "Dante set it up," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, not quite resentment, but the very close relative of it. The voice of a man who had been following someone else's judgment and was now looking for somewhere to put the weight of the consequences. Isabella did not move. "Who from the Moretti side?" "We never dealt with Moretti directly," he said. There was a contact, a woman who said she represented interests aligned with the Moretti family. She didn't give a name we could verify. Isabella thought about the description and what it meant. A woman, acting as an intermediary, running an independent channel into the DeLuca syndicate through assets in the South Territory. Carla Benedetti's voice in her head, smooth and certain of itself. What did you give them? She said. Operational schedules, he said. Territory boundaries. The names of some of the captains. He looked at the floor. Nothing about the transfer. We didn't know about the transfer until Salvatore's people announced it. But you knew afterward. Yes. And you kept talking east. A pause. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what this meant for everything she had spent the last 2 weeks building. If the Moretti side, if Carla, specifically, had the names of the DeLuca captains, had the operational schedules, had been building a picture of the syndicate's structure for 6 months, then the story of Isabella's death was almost certainly already questioned. Carla was not a careless woman. She would have been running independent verification. She would have pulled on every thread available to her. Did you tell them I was here? Isabella said. This location. No, he said. I didn't know you were coming here until this afternoon. The call you just made, what did you tell them? He looked at the floor again. What did you tell them? She said. That the transfer of authority had been confirmed, he said. That you were in the Northeastern Territory. That you had documentation on the Moretti operation. Isabella stood very still. He had told them she was alive. He had told them the transfer was confirmed. He had told them she had documentation. In 31 seconds, he had burned 3 weeks of operational advantage and handed it to the people who had thrown her out in a snowstorm to die. She turned and walked out of the room. Vera was in the hallway. She had been there long enough to hear most of it. Isabella could tell by the way she was standing, that particular stillness of someone processing. Get Caruso, Isabella said, and find Dante Carboni. Vera was already moving. They found Dante in the kitchen, which meant either he hadn't heard yet or he was a better actor than his brother. He was standing at the counter with a coffee cup, and he turned when Isabella came in, and his face ran through 3 expressions in half a second: confusion, recognition, something that might have been the beginning of a decision about how to handle this. And then Caruso was in the doorway behind him, and the decision window closed. Sit down, Isabella said. What's going on? Dante said. Sit down, she said again, and this time there was something behind it that made him pull out the chair and sit. She told him what his brother had said. Precisely, without elaboration. She watched his face and she saw the calculation happening in real time, the assessment of how much Nico had given up, whether denial was still viable, whether there was a version of this where he came out the other side. There wasn't. She could see the moment he understood that. We were protecting our position, he said. Salvatore never told us directly. We didn't know what the transfer meant for our operations in the South. We needed insurance. You needed insurance, she said. We've been running the South Territory for 12 years, he said, and his voice had an edge in it now, not quite anger, but the ground-level resentment that lived just underneath it. 12 years, Salvatore knew us. He trusted us with the territory. And then he dies, and suddenly there's a woman none of us have ever met who's supposed to be in charge, and we're supposed to just accept that. Yes, she said. He blinked. That's exactly what you were supposed to do, she said, because Salvatore made that decision, and his decision is the authority of this organization. That's not a preference. That's the structure you've been operating inside for 12 years. She looked at him. If you had a problem with the transfer, there was a process. You come to Caruso. You request a formal meeting. You raise your concerns through the organization. She paused. Instead, you opened a channel to the people who tried to kill me. He said nothing. Get them out of here, she said to Caruso. Caruso looked at her. Both of them. Both of them. Hold them separately. I'll decide what happens with them after we relocate. The Carbone brothers were walked out by 2 of Caruso's men, and Isabella stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of it. Footsteps, a door, the cold air coming briefly through the opening and then gone. And she pressed her free hand flat against the counter and breathed. The damage assessment was not good. Carla Benedetti, if it was Carla, and she was now almost certain it was, knew Isabella was alive, knew the transfer was confirmed, knew she had documentation. That meant Vincenzo knew, or would know, within hours. That meant the window she'd been working inside had just collapsed. She picked up the phone she'd taken from Nico and looked at the number again. She thought about what she could do with it. Then she dialed. It rang 4 times. A woman's voice answered, careful, unhurried. "Who is this?" "You know who this is?" Isabella said. A pause. 3 seconds. Long enough for recognition to move through it. "Isabella." Carla's voice, when she said the name, carried the particular quality of a person who has been caught mid-plan and is deciding whether to be rattled or not. She decided not. "I heard you were dead." "You heard wrong." "Evidently." A sound that might have been a small, controlled exhale. "You've been busy." "Less busy than you," Isabella said. 18 months of skimming Moretti accounts. That's patient work. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Harder. The silence of something recalibrating. "That's an interesting claim," Carla said. "It's not a claim," Isabella said. "It's a transaction history, account numbers, amounts, dates." She paused. "Vincenzo doesn't know yet." "Is that a threat?" "It's information," Isabella said. "What you do with it is up to you." Another pause. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something," Isabella said. "You built a case against me using evidence you fabricated. You ran a channel into this organization through 2 men who were unhappy about a succession. You've been building an exit strategy from the Moretti family for 18 months while sleeping in Vincenzo's bed." She stopped. "You're very good at this. I want you to know that I recognize it." "That's not what you called to say," Carla said. "No," Isabella said. "I called to tell you that whatever you think is coming next, whatever you've arranged, whatever instruction you've sent in the last hour, stop it. Because if something happens to me or to my daughter, everything I have goes to every federal contact I know, every rival organization that would find it useful, and directly to Vincenzo. All of it, including the 18 months. The line was very quiet. "You can't protect yourself and threaten me at the same time," Carla said. "You don't have enough people." "Try me," Isabella said, and ended the call. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Her hand on the counter was not entirely steady. She noticed that and breathed through it, and it steadied. Caruso came back. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "She knows," he said. It wasn't a question. "She knew before tonight," Isabella said. "The Carbone call confirmed details, but she'd already flagged that I might be alive. She's too careful not to have run independent verification on the death story." She set the phone down on the counter. "We have hours, not days." "Where do we go?" She thought about the locations she knew, the syndicate's properties in the Eastern Territory, which Vera had briefed her on in the car, the secondary safe house near the coast that hadn't been used in months, the property in the Western County that was registered to one of the legitimate businesses and whose connection to the syndicate was not documented anywhere she'd found. "The Western property," she said. "The one under the Marchetti Holdings umbrella." Caruso's expression shifted slightly. "That location hasn't been sanitized for operational use." "Good," she said. "Then it won't look like we're there." The relocation happened in 90 minutes, faster than Vera had planned, with the specific controlled urgency of people who understood that urgency and panic were not the same thing, and that confusing them got people killed. Isabella moved with Lucia and said nothing that wasn't necessary, and watched the way the operation ran itself, and noted the people who moved well under pressure and the people who moved poorly, because this was the kind of information that mattered. The Western property was a farmhouse that had been converted into an event space years ago, and then abandoned when the business that owned it restructured. It was large, drafty, and entirely unremarkable from the road. Inside it smelled like old wood and something floral that had faded to almost nothing. The heating worked. There were enough rooms. They arrived at 2 in the morning. Isabella put Lucia down in a room at the center of the building, the most protected position, the farthest from exterior walls. And she stood at the window and looked at the dark fields, and she thought. She thought for a long time. The plan she had been building, careful, structured, patient, had depended on time, on controlling the information environment long enough to prepare the ground before she moved. That time was gone. Carla knew she was alive. Carla had told Vincenzo, or would tell him, or Vincenzo had already started asking questions when the photographs of a coat in the snow didn't add up to a body anyone had formally confirmed. He was not a man who left loose ends. He would pull the thread, which meant that at some point in the next 24 to 48 hours, Vincenzo Moretti would know that the woman he'd thrown out in the snow was alive, had inherited the De Luca syndicate, and had been quietly assembling a case against his entire operation for 2 weeks. She thought about what he would do with that information. The answer came to her at approximately 3 in the morning when Lucia woke for a feeding and Isabella was sitting in the dark room with her daughter and the silence was complete enough that she could hear her own heartbeat. He would take something from her. That was how Vincenzo operated. She knew it with the certainty of someone who had watched him do it to other people 3 different times in 3 years. When someone had something he needed to neutralize, he didn't come at it directly. He came at what they valued. He found the point of vulnerability, and he applied pressure there until the person either gave him what he needed or broke entirely. The point of vulnerability. She looked down at Lucia's face. She was on her feet before the feeding was finished, moving to the door, opening it, and nearly walking into Vera, who was standing in the hall with a phone in her hand and an expression that told Isabella everything before she said a word. "When?" Isabella said. 40 minutes ago, Vera said. "One of our people near the Moretti estate called it in. A vehicle left the property, 2 men inside. They weren't going toward the city." Isabella looked at her. "They were heading toward the route we took from the farmhouse," Vera said. "Someone gave them the path." "The Carbone brothers," Isabella said. "We have them contained," Vera said quickly. "They haven't had access to a phone since—" "Before," Isabella said. "Before we took the phones. When we were in the meeting, when Nico went to make his call, how long was Dante alone?" Vera's mouth closed. "How long?" Isabella said. 10 minutes, Vera said. "When we were searching for Caruso. Dante was in the kitchen." 10 minutes. Long enough to make one call. Long enough to give someone the farmhouse location and the general direction of travel. Not enough to give them the western property because Dante hadn't known the western property. She'd decided on it after the Carbone brothers were already contained. They didn't know where she was. But they were looking, and they were on the right road, and at some point the road would narrow. "How many men do we have here?" she said. 7 on the property. 3 more I can pull from the Eastern Territory inside 2 hours. "Pull them," she said. "And I need Ricci." Vera looked at her carefully. "You said—" "I know what I said," Isabella said. "I said I wasn't sure about him. I need to be sure now, and the only way to be sure is to read him directly. If he's the source, I need to know that too," Isabella said. "I can't run this organization with half the information. Get him on the phone." Ricci answered on the second ring, which meant either he hadn't been sleeping or he'd been waiting for a call. His voice was alert, which told her nothing by itself. "Something's happened," she said. "I know," he said. "One of my men called me an hour ago. A vehicle left Moretti property." "You know about the vehicle." "I monitor the Moretti estate," he said, and his voice had the flat quality of someone who considers this obvious. "I've had eyes on it for 3 years. Salvatore's standing order." She absorbed that. "Why didn't you mention this at the meeting?" "You didn't ask," he said, "and I wasn't sure how much you knew." "I need to know what the vehicle is doing right now." "My man lost it on the interchange," Ricci said. "They switched vehicles. That's a prepared move. That's not someone reacting." "No," she said. "It's not." She stood in the hallway with the phone against her ear and the drafty old building creaking around her, and she thought about Carla Benedetti, who was very good at this, who had been planning for contingencies for 18 months, who did not make reactive moves. "Ricci," she said. "Yes." "The document I gave you tonight." "It's secure," he said. "I'm going to need it back," she said. "Not for storage. For use." A pause. "How soon?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But the timeline has changed. Everything has moved up." "Understood." A brief silence. "Isabella." It was the first time he'd used her name without a title attached or a qualifier after it. She noted it. "What?" she said. "The Carbone brothers," he said. "I knew Dante had reservations about the transfer. I should have surfaced that before tonight. I didn't." Another silence, the kind that had something in it. "That was my failure." She considered what to do with that. It could be a genuine admission. It could be the careful repositioning of a man trying to get ahead of scrutiny. She looked at the wall across from her. Old plaster, hairline cracks, a rectangle where something had hung for years and left a ghost of itself. "Noted," she said. "Be ready to move when I call." She ended the call. She turned around and Vera was still there, and a few feet behind Vera was Caruso, who had come out of whatever room he'd been in, and the three of them stood in the hallway of the old building at 3 in the morning and looked at each other. "The Moretti family knows I'm alive," Isabella said. "They know about the syndicate. They're looking for me." She looked at Caruso. "How long before they find this location?" "If someone traces the vehicle routing from the farmhouse and they're methodical about it, 12 hours, maybe less." "What would make them stop looking?" she said. Caruso looked at her. "If they had something more pressing to look at." "Yes," she said. She thought about the information she had. The Alderton documentation, the federal official, the Seaver Arms arrangement, Francis Okoro's account analysis. If she deployed any of it now, if she sent it to the right people, started the right fires under the Moretti operation, Vincenzo would have to turn his attention inward. Defending, containing, he would not have the operational bandwidth to hunt her while his organization was burning. But deploying it now meant deploying it before she was ready, before she had the meeting she'd been planning, before she was in the room. She had been building toward a specific moment, the moment when she walked into a room full of Vincenzo's people and his allies, and she let him see what she had become and what she could do. And that moment required preparation she hadn't completed. It required the full assembly of the DeLuca Syndicate, which she hadn't finished. It required the federal channel to be set up correctly, which Francis Okoro hadn't finished yet. It required everything to be in position before she moved, because you only got one opening. If she forced the opening now, she'd get one shot with half her ammunition. She was still turning it over when her phone buzzed. It was a number she didn't recognize. She answered it. "Mrs. Moretti." A man's voice, deliberate and unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone reading from a prepared script, but trying not to sound like it. "I've been asked to relay a message." She said nothing. "Your daughter," the man said. "She's beautiful. Very young, of course. Difficult age to be moved around in winter weather." A pause calibrated to land. "Mr. Moretti would like to discuss the terms of your situation. He's extended an invitation to meet at a location of mutual agreement. He believes there are things that belong to each of you that should be returned." Isabella's hand on the phone did not move. Her breathing did not change. She looked at the wall and she stayed very still, the way she'd learned to stay still when something was happening that she needed to understand completely before she reacted to it. "Tell me what you're actually saying," she said. The man paused, just briefly, as if he'd expected something different. "Mr. Moretti knows where the child is," he said. "He wants a conversation." She ended the call. She stood in the hall for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned to Vera and said, "Lock down this building. Nobody in or out without my direct authorization. I want 2 men on the room where Lucia is sleeping, and I want them there in the next 60 seconds. Vera was already moving. She turned to Caruso. "Get me everything we have on the Moretti family's properties, within 50 miles of here. Every location they own or control or use. I want it in 20 minutes. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the thing that happened on the far side of fear when the last option that didn't require you to become something harder had finally closed. "That I've been trying to do this correctly. That I've been patient and careful, and I've been building this the right way because I wanted to be ready before I moved." She looked at him. "He just made that irrelevant," she said. Caruso held her gaze. He saw something in her face that made him go very still, the way experienced men went still when the situation had shifted into a register they recognized. "What do you need?" he said. I need every captain in this organization on a call in 1 hour, she said. And I need Ricci to bring me back that document. She reached into her coat and pulled out the second prepaid phone she'd been saving, still in its packaging, and she turned it over in her hands. And I need Frances Okoro's analysis, whatever she has finished, right now, not when it's done. It won't be complete, Vera said from down the hall. It doesn't need to be complete, Isabella said. It needs to be enough. She looked at the room where her daughter was sleeping, the closed door, the two men Vera had positioned flanking it with their backs straight and their attention forward. They had threatened her daughter, not directly, carefully, deniably, with the language of concern and invitation and terms. But the meaning was precise, and Vincenzo knew she would understand it precisely because he had taught her to read exactly this kind of language during 3 years of watching him use it on other people. He had taken the last thing she had been protecting. She looked at the door, and she thought about the woman she had been trying to be, measured, strategic, building toward a moment that was clean and complete and undeniable. She thought about all the ways she had been preserving something in herself, some version of this that didn't require her to stop calculating and start burning. He had taken that from her too. She turned away from the door and walked toward the main room where Caruso was already pulling up maps on the laptop, and Vera was on a phone in the corner running the lockdown with clipped efficiency. And as she walked, she felt the last of the measured version of this slip off her, like something she'd been wearing too long. And what was underneath it was colder and cleaner and entirely without the hesitation that had been slowing her down. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table and looked at the map, and she said, "Show me where he is." The map on the laptop showed 7 Moretti-controlled properties within 50 miles. Caruso had them flagged in red, each one annotated with the last known use date and the number of personnel typically stationed there. Isabella looked at all 7 and then looked at one specifically, a private club on the east side of the city, the kind that appeared in no directory, that occupied the 3rd and 4th floors of a building whose ground floor was a legitimate import business, the kind with a standing reservation for quarterly reviews. "He's there," she said. Caruso looked at the screen. "The club. That's his operational center. He wouldn't use it for something like this. It's too exposed." "He's using it exactly because it's his ground," she said. "He's not hiding. He wants me to come to him. He wants me to walk in the front door and sit down across from him and negotiate." "Which you're not going to do," Vera said from across the room. "Which I am going to do," Isabella said. The room went quiet. "He has leverage," she said. "He thinks he has leverage. The phone call was designed to make me feel that, to make me reactive." She looked at the map. "But that call told me something he didn't intend it to. He said he knows where the child is. He doesn't. If he knew where Lucia was, he would have said something specific, a detail, a location, something to prove it." She looked at Caruso. "He's fishing. He knows I'm alive. He knows the syndicate transfer happened, and he's trying to get me into a room where he controls the variables." "And you want to go anyway," Caruso said. "I want to go before he figures out he has no leverage," she said. "Right now he thinks I'm scared. Scared people make offers. Scared people give things up to protect what they love." She closed the laptop. "I want to be in that room while he still thinks that's what I am." Vera looked at Caruso. Caruso looked at the closed laptop. Then he looked at Isabella with the expression of a man who had lived long enough in this world to recognize when an argument was already decided. "1 hour," he said. "We need 1 hour to set the perimeter." "You have 40 minutes, she said. She spent 20 of those minutes on the phone with the DeLuca captains. 7 men in total, reached in sequence, each conversation under 3 minutes. She did not explain, and she did not request. She told them what she needed, where she needed it, and when. 2 of them pushed back, not against the plan, but against the timeline. She told them the timeline was not a variable and moved on. When she was done, she sat for 3 minutes in the room where Lucia was sleeping, in the chair beside the improvised crib, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall. Lucia was asleep. Lucia did not know that her mother was about to walk into the building where the man who'd thrown them both out in a blizzard was waiting with whatever he thought constituted a winning hand. Lucia did not know anything about any of it, and Isabella sat with that for 3 minutes and let herself feel exactly what she felt, which was a species of fear so complete and specific that it had moved past the point of being incapacitating and arrived somewhere that felt almost like clarity. And then she stood up and walked out of the room and did not look back. The drive to the city took 32 minutes. Isabella rode in the middle vehicle of three, dressed in clothes that Vera had sourced from somewhere: a dark wool coat, good boots, the kind of clothes that said money without announcing it. She had the document from Ricci in her inner pocket. She had the analysis from Francis Okoro, partial but sufficient, in a sealed envelope. She had the prepaid phone and the flash drive that held the copies of the Alderton files. She had Caruso in the front seat and two of his best men in the vehicle behind. She did not have enough. She knew she did not have enough. What she had was the willingness to move anyway, and she had learned, in the last 3 weeks, that in this particular world that counted for more than she would have thought. They stopped 2 blocks from the building. Caruso's men had been on the perimeter for 20 minutes already. She could see one of them on the opposite corner, indistinguishable from a man waiting for a cab. Ricci was somewhere in the building across the street with 2 of his people and a line to the right ear in the federal building on 5th. "You go in alone," Caruso said. It was not a question. It was confirmation of what she had told him. "I go in alone," she said. "If it goes wrong—" "It's not going to go wrong," she said. He looked at her. "It's not," she said, "because I know exactly what he's going to do. He's going to try to make me small. That's what he does. He reduces people. He finds the thing that makes you feel like you need him, and he presses on it until you believe it." She looked out the window at the building. "He doesn't know that I spent the last 3 weeks becoming something he has no category for." She got out of the car. The building's entrance was a single door of dark glass with no signage. A man she didn't recognize was standing just inside, and when she pushed through, he looked at her without surprise, which meant she'd been expected. Of course she had. They'd wanted her to come. "3rd floor," he said. "I know," she said, and walked past him to the elevator. The 3rd floor hallway was carpeted and dim, the kind of place designed for conversations that didn't happen in daylight. She walked to the end of it without slowing and pushed through the door to the dining room. There were 6 people in the room. Vincenzo was at the head of the table. He was dressed the way he was always dressed, as if no situation had ever rattled him enough to show in his clothes. And he looked at her when she came in with those flat gray eyes, and the expression that had always made her feel, in the 3 years she'd known him, that he was reading something written on her that she couldn't see herself. To his left was Carla Benedetti. Isabella looked at Carla for exactly 1 second. Carla looked back. Neither of them said anything yet. The other 4 were men she recognized from the Moretti operation. 2 captains, a lawyer whose name was Sandoval, and who had facilitated arrangements she knew specific details about, and a man she had only seen once before, but whose presence in this room told her that Vincenzo had already started making defensive calls. His name was Pryor. He was a federal liaison, and his presence here meant Vincenzo was trying to build a shield. Isabella pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down. Vincenzo looked at her. "You look well," he said. "Considering." "Considering," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "You called. I came." She put nothing on the table yet. She kept her hands in her coat pockets, and she sat and she looked at him with the same calibration she'd been using for 2 weeks, reading faces, reading rooms, reading the distance between what people said and what they meant. "We have things to discuss," he said. "We do," she said. "Your situation has changed," he said, "significantly. We understand that. There's been some miscommunication about your loyalty, and we're prepared to revisit that if you're willing to discuss a reasonable arrangement." She looked at him. "What arrangement?" "The DeLuca transfer," he said. "You've inherited something substantial. That creates a dynamic that didn't exist 3 weeks ago. We think there's a version of this where our organizations operate with an understanding rather than at cross purposes." She let that sit for a moment. "You want to negotiate with the DeLuca syndicate. I want to talk to you," he said. "Not as former family, as what you are now." She looked at Carla, who was watching with the focused attention of a woman monitoring every variable in a situation she had helped engineer. "Ask her to leave," Isabella said. Vincenzo's expression did not change. "Carla stays." Then this conversation is over, Isabella said. She did not move to stand. She said it the way she'd say anything else, level, without heat. Vincenzo looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Carla. Carla's jaw tightened. She stood without a word and walked to the far end of the room, positioning herself near the wall, the same position she'd taken in the bedroom the night Isabella had been expelled from the estate. Isabella watched her and thought about how habitual that position was. Near the wall, never in the center of a room she didn't control. Better, Isabella said. Vincenzo leaned forward slightly. You've been building something these last weeks. Yes. You have documentation on our operations. Yes. And you've been talking to people who have reason to want to damage us. Yes, she said again. His jaw shifted once. Then you understand why we needed to establish contact. You have things that could cause significant problems for this organization, and we have my daughter, she said. The word landed. Vincenzo's expression moved. Not much, but it moved. I told you that night, she said. The night you walked into my room, I told you that if you touched her, she's safe, he said. She's been safe. I made a reference to her well-being as a reminder that we all have things at stake here. You threatened my child, she said. Her voice was exactly the same as it had been. She had decided before she walked in that this was the one thing she would not let change her register, because changing her register would tell him it still worked. Using a phone call with a borrowed voice on a number I didn't recognize, trying to make me feel what exactly, Vincenzo? That I'm still the woman you could throw out in a storm and expect to die quietly. He looked at her across the length of the table. You're not, he said. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she was going to get from him, and she knew it. No, she said. I'm not. She reached into her coat. She took out 3 things and placed them on the table. The Alderton documentation, the Francis Okoro analysis, and the sealed envelope with the notarized statement about the federal official whose name made Pryor, at the far end of the table, go very still when he saw the edge of it. I'm not going to make a speech, she said. You know what those are. You know what they represent. So I'll say this once. She looked at Vincenzo directly. This organization, the Moretti operation, everything you've built in the last 20 years, it ends. Not because I want revenge. Because you made an enemy of someone you should never have touched, and now you don't have the option of walking this back. She paused. What you have is a choice about how it ends. Vincenzo looked at the documents. He looked at Pryor, whose face had acquired the texture of old chalk. He looked back at Isabella. You're sitting in my building, he said. With what, 6 men outside? You came in here alone. You're talking to me about options. I came in here alone because I don't need what's outside, she said. What I need is in here, on that table. Sandoval, the lawyer, reached for the Alderton documentation. Isabella put her hand on it before he could lift it, flat and firm, without looking at him. Don't, she said. He withdrew his hand. 3 weeks ago, she said to Vincenzo, I was thrown out of that house with a 3-day-old baby in a snowstorm. You expected me to die in the road. You had already moved on. She kept her eyes on him. I want you to understand what happened in those 3 weeks. Not the details. You'll find out the details in time. I want you to understand the principle. She paused. Every person who wanted to believe that the woman you discarded had nothing is going to understand very soon what she had, what she's always had, what you spent 3 years being in a room with and never once actually looked at. The room was completely still. Carla moved. It was a small movement, a shift of weight, a hand going into her jacket, and Isabella saw it in her peripheral vision the same moment Vincenzo's eyes moved to track it, and there was a fraction of a second where the room was in the balance, where the next 2 seconds could go in any direction, and Isabella said, without raising her voice, the building is surrounded. Every exit is covered. And there are federal agents in the lobby who were called 40 minutes ago by a man with a notarized statement about a specific arrangement with a specific official whose name is on the page in that envelope. She looked at Pryor. Mr. Pryor knows which official I mean? Pryor stood up. He said nothing. He walked to the door and opened it, and walked out, and the door swung closed behind him. Nobody stopped him. Vincenzo watched him go, and something moved behind his eyes. The particular look of a man watching a wall he built come apart brick by brick, and he said nothing. Carla's hand came out of her jacket empty. "Sit down, Carla," Isabella said. Carla sat down. The two Moretti captains were looking at Vincenzo with the expression of men who needed instruction and were not receiving it. Sandoval had his hands flat on the table and was looking at the middle distance with the focused blankness of a man doing rapid calculations about liability and exposure. Vincenzo looked at Isabella. "You planned this," he said. "I planned the moment," she said. "The last 3 weeks were preparation. Tonight is just when I decided to stop waiting for the right time and accept that the right time was when you threatened my daughter." "I didn't threaten. Vincenzo." She said his name the way she hadn't said it in 3 years, not as a wife, not with any of the layers the word had accumulated, just as his name, a sound that belonged to a person who was sitting across from her making decisions that were already made. "Stop." He stopped. She picked up the Alderton documentation and the Francis Okoro analysis. She left the sealed envelope on the table. "That stays here," she said. "That's already been submitted. You understand what I mean by that?" "Well," Sandoval understood. She could see it. Vincenzo understood. She could see that too. "What happens now?" Vincenzo said. It was the flattest she had ever heard his voice, stripped of the deliberate cadence, the control. Just the question. "Now," she said, "you find out what it costs." She stood up. She buttoned her coat. She looked at Carla Benedetti one more time. Carla, who had set all of this in motion, who had fabricated a betrayal and driven a husband and wife apart, and fed information east, and built an exit strategy while sitting in someone else's house. And Carla looked back at her with the expression of a woman who had lost and knew it and was deciding what to do with that knowledge. "The accounts," Isabella said to her. "The 18 months. He'll find that too eventually. I'd think about that." She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Vincenzo say her name. Not Mrs. Moretti, not his wife. Her name. She stopped with her hand on the door. "This isn't finished," he said. She turned back. She looked at him across the room, across the table with the documents on it, and the two men who were supposed to protect his interests sitting very still and not looking at anyone. "No," she said. "It's not." She went through the door. The hallway was empty. She walked its length and hit the elevator button and stood waiting with her eyes on the doors. And she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she hadn't been since she'd walked into the room, fast, not controlled, the blood doing what blood did when it had been held in check for 2 hours and the check had been removed. Her hands inside her coat pockets were not steady. She noted that and breathed and let the elevator come. On the ground floor, the man by the door looked at her as she passed. "Have a good evening," he said, the automatic courtesy of someone who had been told to say it. She didn't answer. She walked out the door into the night air. It was cold. Not the cold of the blizzard 3 weeks ago. This was a different cold, the dry, still cold of a clear night, and it hit her face and she stopped on the sidewalk for 1 second and breathed it. Caruso materialized from 20 feet away, moving fast, his face asking the question before he did. "It's done," she said. "The envelope's on the table. Pryor left. Call whoever you need to call and make sure the submission went through." "It went through," he said. "Ricci confirmed 12 minutes ago." "Good." She started walking toward the car. "We need to get back to Lucia." "Isabella." Caruso fell in beside her. "What happened in there?" She thought about the room, about Vincenzo's face when Pryor stood up and walked out, about Carla's hand coming out of her jacket empty, about the two captains looking at their boss and finding nothing there to follow, about Sandoval with his hands flat on the table, already doing the math on how to distance himself from a structure that was beginning to collapse. "He found out," she said. "Found out what?" "What he threw away," she said. The car was at the corner. She got in. Caruso got in beside her, and the driver pulled out immediately, smooth and fast, the way people drove when they'd been trained to move without being told twice. She took out the phone. She dialed Vera. "We're moving," she said when Vera picked up. "New location. I'll give you the address when we're 5 minutes out. How's Lucia?" "Asleep," Vera said. "She's been asleep since you left." "Keep 2 men on the room," she said. We'll be there in 40 minutes. She ended the call. She looked out the window at the city going past. The lights, the late-night traffic, the ordinary machinery of a place that had no idea what had just happened in a third-floor dining room, and she thought about what came next. What came next was the full assembly she hadn't completed yet, the captain she hadn't fully secured, the federal channel that was now open and needed to be managed correctly, or it would run away from her. The Moretti organization, which was not dead, it was wounded and aware of the wound, and that made it more dangerous, not less, in the short term. Vincenzo, who had said this isn't finished, and who was correct. And Carla Benedetti, who had walked into this room tonight and sat against the wall and said nothing and given nothing away, and who was, of all the people in that room, the one Isabella was least sure she had neutralized. She thought about Carla's hand going into her jacket, coming out empty. She thought about what it meant that Carla had made that move and then stopped. Not because she was caught, because she had decided not to. Because a woman who had been building an exit strategy for 18 months had looked at the room and done the math and decided that whatever she had in her hand, the cost of using it was higher than she was willing to pay right now. Which meant Carla still thought she had options. Which meant Carla was not finished. Caruso's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His face changed. She saw it and said, "What?" He looked at her. "One of the men from the Moretti building," he said. "He followed Pryor out. Pryor didn't go to the lobby." He stopped. "Where did he go?" she said. "Side exit," Caruso said. "There's a vehicle that was parked on the south side of the building. Pryor got in it." He paused. There was already someone in it. Isabella looked at him, and she already knew, with the specific knowledge of someone who had spent 3 weeks learning to read the architecture of a situation, what he was going to say before he said it. "It was a woman," Caruso said. "Our man got a partial on the vehicle, but not the plates. He described her as dark hair," Isabella said. "Silk." Caruso's jaw tightened. "Yes." Carla had left the room before Isabella. While Isabella had been standing at Vincenzo's table watching Pryor walk out, Carla had already been moving. She had not sat against the wall and accepted the loss. She had done what she had always done. She had identified the exit before anyone closed it, and she had taken it, and she had taken the federal liaison with her, which meant she had something on Pryor that Isabella didn't know about, something that had made him get in a car with a woman who was supposed to be on the losing side. The car moved through the city, and Isabella looked at the window and understood that the thing she had thought was over, the confrontation she had thought she had won, had just opened into something larger and more complicated, and that Carla Benedetti, who had started all of this, who had built the frame that brought Isabella's marriage down, who had been playing a longer game than anyone in that room had understood, was not contained. She was loose. She was in a vehicle with a federal official whose cooperation she had just secured. And somewhere in the city, with whatever she had accumulated in 18 months of careful preparation, she was already planning what came next. Isabella's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it. She answered. Carla's voice came through without preamble, without the careful formality of the phone call earlier, stripped down to something that sounded almost like admiration. "You were better than I thought," Carla said. "I want you to know I mean that." "Where are you?" Isabella said. "Somewhere useful," Carla said. "I've had 18 months to build what I built, and I've had 3 weeks watching you build what you built, and I want to tell you something, Isabella. What you did tonight, that was the opening move." Isabella's hand on the phone was absolutely still. "The opening move," Carla said. "Not the last one. Vincenzo is going to fall. You built that correctly. I won't take that from you. But there are things in motion right now that you don't know about. Things I put in place before I walked into that room tonight. And when those things complete, the question of who controls the DeLuca Syndicate is going to become very interesting again." "What things?" Isabella said. A pause. "Ask Ricci," Carla said, "where he was the night Don Salvatore signed the transfer documents." The line went dead. The car moved through the city, and Isabella sat with the phone in her hand and the cold coming through the window seal and the sound of Caruso already dialing someone. And she thought about what Carla had just said, and she thought about Ricci, who had known the Moretti estate for 3 years, who had monitored it, who had been so careful and so present at every critical moment, and she thought about the night Salvatore De Luca had signed the documents that transferred everything to her, the night that had changed the entire shape of the future. And she thought about who might have wanted to be near that moment, and what they might have done if they'd been there. And then Vera called and said, "Isabella, the men on Lucia's room." The silence before the next word lasted half a second, and it was the longest half second of Isabella's life. "One of them is down," Vera said. The man on the floor outside Lucia's room was breathing. That was the first thing Isabella confirmed when she came through the door of the Western property at a pace that was not quite running, because running told everyone around you that the situation had passed the point of control, and she needed everyone around her to believe the situation had not passed that point. She came through fast, and she went straight to the hallway, and she looked at the man on the floor, one of Caruso's, a solid, quiet man named Teo, who had positioned himself outside that door 4 hours ago, and she crouched and put 2 fingers to his neck and felt the pulse, steady and present, and breathed. "What happened?" she said. Vera was beside her. Sedative, injected. He didn't hear whoever came up behind him. "The second man." "Gone," Vera said. "We don't know when." The outer perimeter check came back clean 40 minutes ago, which means whoever took Teo out came in during the window between that check and the next one. 40 minutes. Isabella had been in the car for 38 of those minutes, driving back from the city. She stood up and put her hand on the door to Lucia's room and pushed it open. The room was empty. The improvised crib was there. The blankets were there, folded back, as if someone had lifted a sleeping child out of them with care rather than urgency. The lamp was still on. Everything in the room was exactly as it had been, minus the child who was supposed to be in it, and the specific quality of that absence, the lamp still on, the blankets still warm when Isabella pressed her hand to them, was the most precise kind of violence she had ever experienced. She stood in the center of the room, and she did not make a sound. Behind her, Caruso said her name. She turned around. Her face was doing something she wasn't fully in control of, but she kept her voice level. "Get me Ricci." "Isabella, get me Ricci. Right now." She walked past him to the main room, and she stood at the table where the maps were still spread out, and she put both hands flat on the surface, and she breathed. In the car, after Vera's call, she had done the math. 40 minutes. Whoever took Lucia had a 40-minute head start. They had moved quietly, carefully, without triggering the outer perimeter, which meant they knew where the perimeter was, which meant they had information about this location that they should not have had. She thought about Carla's voice on the phone. Ask Ricci where he was the night Don Salvatore signed the transfer documents. She thought about Ricci with the document in his jacket, nodding once, saying he'd be ready when she called. She thought about what it meant that Carla had known to use Ricci's name, not as a guess, as a specific piece of information she'd had long enough to deploy at the right moment. Caruso came back. "He's not answering." "His men," she said. "I reached one of them. He says Ricci left 45 minutes ago. Personal matter." 45 minutes. 5 minutes before Teo went down. She straightened. She looked at the map. The Moretti properties she'd cataloged earlier were still marked in red, and she looked at them with different eyes now, not as targets, but as hiding places, as the locations of a man who had served the De Luca syndicate for 22 years and had apparently spent some portion of that time also serving someone else. "Ricci has her," she said. Caruso looked at her. "He took her," she said. "Not Vincenzo's people." "Ricci. Carla told him I was in the building. He used the window while we were all focused on the city." She traced the map with one finger. "He wouldn't take her to a Moretti property. He'd take her somewhere that was his." "We don't have a list of his personal properties." "No," she said. "But we have 22 years of his operational history. Where does a man like Ricci go when he needs to disappear? Not a syndicate property and not his registered address." She looked at Caruso. "He has something off the books. Everyone does. Think." Vera spoke from the doorway. "He has a brother," she said. "Half-brother, not in the life. Owns a property out on the county line. A repair shop with living quarters above it. Ricci used it once, 8 years ago, when we had a situation that required him to be somewhere unofficial. I filed it and forgot it." "Where?" Isabella said. 22 minutes later, 3 vehicles turned onto a county road in the dark with their headlights off, running on the ambient light of a clear night over snow. And Isabella sat in the front of the middle vehicle and watched the shape of a building resolve in the dark ahead. A long, low structure with a garage bay and a lit window on the second floor. One vehicle in the lot, Ricci's. "How do you want to do this?" Caruso said. "I go in," she said. "Yep. You hold the perimeter." "That's not— He has my daughter in there," she said. "If he sees a tactical approach, he does something with that leverage, and we lose the option I need." She looked at Caruso. "He doesn't want to hurt her. She's the only thing keeping him in a negotiating position. As long as I don't give him a reason to change that calculation, she's safe. And if you're wrong, then I'm wrong, and you come in anyway," she said. "But I'm not wrong." She got out of the car. The lot was cold and quiet, gravel under a skin of packed snow, and her boots made a sound with each step that she couldn't prevent and didn't try to. She crossed to the door at the side of the building, not the garage bay, the residential entrance, and she knocked. Silence. Then footsteps on stairs. The door opened and Ricci stood in it. He was still in his coat from the meeting, and he looked at her the way she had been looking at people all night, assessing, measuring the distance between what was visible and what wasn't. "You found me fast," he said. "Vera remembered the brother," she said. Something in his face acknowledged this, not quite regret, more like the expression of a man noting where his plan had a seam. "Is she all right?" Isabella said. "She's asleep," he said. She's been asleep the whole time. She didn't wake up." "Show me." He stepped back from the door. She came in. The ground floor was a workspace, tools on walls, a metal bench, the smell of grease and solvent. He led her up the stairs without turning his back to her, and without reaching for anything, which she noted. At the top, a small room with a cot and a workbench and a lamp, and in a padded box on the floor, wrapped in a blanket she recognized from the western property, Lucia was asleep. Isabella crossed the room in 4 steps and crouched and put the back of her hand against her daughter's cheek and felt the warmth there and the rhythm of her breathing, and she held that for a moment. Then she stood up and turned around. Ricci was by the door. His hands were at his sides, and he was watching her with the particular stillness of a man who understood that the next several minutes were going to determine the rest of his life. "Sit down," she said. He pulled out the chair from the workbench and sat. She remained standing. "Tell me about the night Salvatore signed the transfer." He looked at the floor. He was quiet for a moment. Not building a lie, she could tell the difference by now, and what he was doing was the opposite of that. He was deciding how much of the truth to give her, which was its own answer. "I was there," he said, "at the signing." "Before the signing," he said, "Salvatore called me in, 2 weeks before he died. He told me what he was doing, the transfer, the full succession to you. He told me who you were." He paused. "He told me he was sorry." "Sorry for what?" "For not choosing one of us." He said it without particular bitterness, which made it worse. "Just a fact," stated flatly. 22 years. For me, for the captains who'd been with him since the beginning. He sat in that room and he told me he was sorry, and then he told me the decision was made and nothing would change it. "And you went to Carla," Isabella said. "Not directly," he said. "There was a contact through the Seaver connection. I didn't know then that it was Carla specifically. I knew it was the Moretti side. I thought—" He stopped. "You thought if the transfer was disrupted," she said, "there would be a new succession, one that included you." "I thought if there was enough instability in the transition," he said carefully, "that the captains would demand a different resolution. A resolution that put you at the head of the organization." He didn't deny it. She looked at him. She looked at the man who had sat across the table from her and nodded when she gave him the document and said Salvatore's choice. "I'm not arguing his right to make it, while having already spent 2 weeks working to undo it." She thought about the 22 years he had given to this organization, the real years, the years that had cost him things she would never fully know. She thought about what it meant to give that much and then watch it handed to a stranger. She didn't excuse it, but she understood it with a completeness that surprised her. "The document," she said, "the one I gave you tonight. Where is it?" He reached into his jacket and held it out. She took it. Did you copy it? She said. No, he said. He looked at her directly when he said it, and it was the first thing he'd said all night that she believed without qualification. She put the document in her coat. She looked at him for a long moment. Carla used you, she said. Whatever she told you about the succession, whatever she implied would happen if the transfer fell apart, she was building her own exit, not yours. She was using the channel you opened to position herself. And when I walked into that room tonight, she walked out with Pryor, because Pryor is the next piece of her plan, and you were never part of it. Ricci's face did something that took a moment to complete, the expression of a man absorbing a truth that rearranges a significant amount of what he thought he knew. She played you, Isabella said. It wasn't cruel, it was just true. The same way she played Vincenzo. She found the place where your resentment lived, and she pointed it in a direction that was useful to her. He looked at the floor. Here's what happens now, Isabella said. You're going to walk out of this building and get in a vehicle with Caruso's men, and you're going to answer every question they have about the channel you opened and every piece of information that passed through it. Everything. Not the version you think is survivable, everything. She paused. And then I'm going to decide what to do with you. He looked up. You have 22 years in this organization, she said. You know things I need to know. You have relationships with captains I haven't secured yet. You have, somewhere under the last 6 weeks of bad judgment, the quality that made Salvatore trust you for 2 decades. She looked at him steadily. I'm not going to waste that, but I'm also not going to pretend tonight didn't happen. What you did, taking her. She stopped. Her voice had done something, and she controlled it. That's the line you don't come back from as if it didn't happen. You understand that? Yes, he said. So you earn it back, she said. From the bottom. Whatever I give you to do, you do it. Whatever question I ask, you answer it. You don't make decisions that aren't yours to make. And you start by helping me find Carla Benedetti. He looked at her. Something in his face was moving through a sequence she let happen without interrupting. Pryor, he said finally. She's going to use Pryor to build protection. Federal cover. She's been planning for a scenario where the Moretti operation fell, and she needed somewhere to land. I know, Isabella said. What does she have on him? His arrangement with Vincenzo wasn't voluntary, Ricci said. He was leveraged into it 3 years ago. She would have documentation of the initial leverage. She can use that to either keep him cooperative or burn him, depending on what's more useful. Where does she go? Isabella said. If she's building federal cover and she's trying to stay out of reach of both the Moretti collapse and me, where does she position herself? Ricci thought. He was genuinely thinking, she could see it, not performing the appearance of cooperation, but actually running through what he knew. There's a man in the city, he said. Name is Geist. He runs a legal practice that functions as a clearinghouse for people who need official protection for unofficial reasons. Carla used him 2 years ago for something involving one of her accounts. If she's building cover, she goes through Geist. Can you get me a location? I can get you an address, he said. Whether she's there is different. Get me the address, she said. Tonight. She picked up Lucia, who stirred slightly at the movement, made a small sound, and settled back into sleep against Isabella's shoulder. She held her daughter and looked at Ricci for a moment. Go downstairs, she said. Tell Caruso you're cooperating. Don't make me explain it to him. Just do it. He stood. He moved to the door. He stopped. I knew your mother, he said. A little. When she was young. Before she left. He didn't turn around. She was stubborn the same way. It wasn't always an asset. A pause. On you it looks different. He went down the stairs. Isabella stood in the small room with her daughter and the lamp and the silence of a building in winter, and she let herself have 30 seconds of nothing. 30 seconds where she didn't assess or plan or measure or hold anything together. She stood and held Lucia and breathed and felt the weight of everything that had happened in the last month settle into her body all at once. The blizzard, the road, the farmhouse, the meetings, the table, the phone call, this room. And she let it be what it was, which was the accumulated cost of surviving something that had been designed to kill her, and she did not pretend it was anything less than that. Then she went downstairs. Carla Benedetti was found 4 days later. Not through Geist, who had lawyered up within 6 hours of Ricci's name appearing in a federal filing and whose offices were legally untouchable by the time Isabella's people reached them. Through a different thread, Frances Okoro, who had been quietly finishing her account analysis and who found, in the structure of the accounts she'd been tracking, a transfer that had happened the night of the meeting in the city. A transfer that moved a significant sum from a Moretti-adjacent account to a private vehicle registered in a name that took 12 hours to trace but eventually led to a property 2 states north, a clean rented house with a view of water and a woman who had packed methodically and planned to be unreachable. She was not unreachable. Isabella drove up with Caruso and Vera and 2 of Ricci's men, who had been assigned to this specifically because using Ricci's people to close the last open thread of a situation that Ricci had helped create was the kind of accountability that the organization needed to see. They arrived in the morning when the light off the water was flat and white, and the house looked exactly like what it was trying to look like, a place where nothing significant was happening. Carla answered the door. She was in different clothes than the night of the meeting, practical clothes, the clothes of someone who had already moved past the version of herself that wore silk to mafia negotiations. She looked at Isabella without apparent surprise, which meant she had been waiting for this, which meant she had not, despite everything, believed she was actually unreachable. "Come in," Carla said. They came in. The house was sparsely furnished, the furniture of a rental, and on the kitchen table there was a coffee cup and a laptop and a set of documents that Carla made no move to close or hide. Isabella looked at the documents without touching them. "Sit down," Isabella said. Carla sat. Isabella sat across from her. Caruso and Vera took positions in the room, and Ricci's men stayed near the door, and the house was very quiet except for the sound of water outside the window. "I want to understand something," Isabella said. Carla looked at her. "The frame you built against me," Isabella said. "The betrayal you constructed. You could have just pushed me out through Vincenzo without it. He was already pulling away. You were already winning." She looked at her. "Why the elaborate construction?" Carla was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because you weren't going to leave quietly," she said. "I watched you for 2 years. I knew what you were. If I just pushed Vincenzo to end the marriage, you would have had leverage. You would have had 3 years of what you'd seen inside that organization, and you would have used it." She paused. "I needed you discredited. Not just gone. Discredited." "So the betrayal narrative was insurance," Isabella said. "It was a sealed door," Carla said. "If Vincenzo believed you'd sold him out, he wouldn't listen to anything you said afterward. Whatever you tried to do with what you knew, he'd discount it." "It almost worked," Isabella said. "It did work," Carla said. "For 3 weeks it worked completely. You were out, you were discredited, you were supposed to be dead, and I had positioned myself inside his operation." She said it without pride and without apology. It was the account of a plan stated by the person who made it. What I didn't anticipate was Salvatore. "Nobody anticipated Salvatore," Isabella said. "No?" For the first time, something in Carla's face moved that wasn't calculation. "He was a careful man. I had no idea the transfer existed until the Carbone brothers surfaced it." She looked at the table. "By then you were already building." "And so you accelerated," Isabella said. "You started closing your own exit faster, prior, the federal cover, the accounts." "I'm a practical person," Carla said. "I know," Isabella said. "That's why I came here instead of sending someone." Carla looked at her. "Practical people don't stop being useful just because they're on the wrong side of something," Isabella said. "What you know about the Moretti operation's federal entanglements, what you have on Pryor specifically, I need that. Not a version of it, all of it." Carla was quiet. "You're not getting the exit you planned," Isabella said. "That's gone. The accounts are frozen. Frances Okoro finished her analysis, and the federal filing included the transaction you made 4 nights ago." She watched Carla absorb this. "But there's a version of what comes next for you that doesn't involve a federal cell. That version requires full cooperation. Not the cooperation of someone managing their exposure, full cooperation. Every name, every document, every arrangement you know about." Carla looked out the window at the water. "And Vincenzo," she said. "He's already cooperating," Isabella said. not willingly, but the Alderton documentation moved through the right channels and his operation started coming apart at the business end 48 hours ago. His captains are doing the math on their own futures. Sandoval has already filed a motion that essentially amounts to a public divorce from the Moretti organization. She paused. Vincenzo is finished. What happens to him personally depends on how many people around him decide that loyalty is less valuable than distance. Carla looked at the table. She looked at the documents in front of her. She looked at Isabella. "You're going to run the DeLuca syndicate," she said. "Yes," Isabella said, "and you came here yourself to offer me a deal." "I came here myself," Isabella said, "because I wanted to look at you and understand what I was looking at. I've spent 4 weeks being inside the consequences of what you did. I wanted to see the person, not just the architecture." Carla was quiet for a long moment. "What do you see?" she said. Isabella thought about it honestly. She thought about a woman who had spent years building influence inside an organization she didn't inherit and couldn't join by right, who had used the tools available to her with a precision that was genuinely impressive, who had planned and pivoted and adapted in real time when the situation changed under her. She thought about what that capacity could have been in a different context, pointed in a different direction. "I see someone who was very good at playing inside someone else's game," Isabella said. "And I see someone who never had a game of her own." Something passed through Carla's face, quick and gone. "That's accurate," Carla said quietly. The cooperation agreement took 3 hours to formalize, with Vera taking notes and 2 legal documents drafted on the laptop at the kitchen table. When it was done, Carla handed over a drive that contained the full prior documentation and a second set of files that connected 3 additional federal officials to the Moretti operation's money flow. It was more than Isabella had expected. It was the kind of depth that came from 18 months of a careful woman building herself a parachute. Pryor was formally interviewed by federal investigators 11 days later. The investigation into the Moretti operation became, within 3 weeks, one of the larger organized crime proceedings in the state's recent history. Vincenzo Moretti was indicted on 17 counts. He did not fight extradition when the secondary charges filed in the Western District came through. He sat in a courtroom and looked at the evidence against him and said nothing useful to anyone, which was consistent with who he had always been. He went away for a long time, and when he went alone, because the organization that might have maintained loyalty to him had already reorganized around its own survival. Sandoval pled out. The Alderton connection collapsed the political infrastructure it had been feeding for 8 years, which caused an additional cascade that Isabella had not planned for but was not unhappy about. Devin Marsh, whose second set of books had been in a storage unit for 14 months, was arrested on a Tuesday morning and was cooperating with investigators before noon. The Carbone brothers were released from the DeLuca syndicate's custody after 3 weeks of full cooperation and sent to a location in the western part of the country, with the clear understanding that their future involvement in any criminal organization would be treated as a betrayal of the terms they'd agreed to. Dante had not said a word to Isabella when he left. Nico had looked at her at the door and said, "I'm sorry." And she had looked at him and said, "I know." And that was all there was to say about it. Ricci came back into the organization at the level of a lieutenant. Not a captain, not a senior voice, but a working position with real responsibilities and real accountability assigned to the Southern Territory, which was the ground he knew. He did not object to the reduction. He worked. He answered questions when they were asked. He brought in 2 additional DeLuca captains who had been on the edge of the transition and hadn't fully committed, and he did it because Isabella asked him to, and not for any other reason. And that was the beginning of the thing being rebuilt. The full assembly of the DeLuca captains happened 6 weeks after the night of the meeting in the city. 10 men around a table in a room that Salvatore DeLuca had used for the same purpose for 30 years, at the headquarters that had been his and was now hers. And Isabella sat at the head of it and looked at all of them and said what she had to say clearly and without performance. She told them what had happened, all of it. The leak, the Carbone situation, Ricci's role and the consequences it had, Carla and the federal unraveling of the Moretti operation, the full picture of how close the transition had come to failing. She did not minimize any of it. She did not position herself as having had it under control throughout. She told them where she had been wrong, where she had been late, where she had moved on incomplete information. When she was done, the room was quiet. One of the older captains, a man named Ferrante who had been with the syndicate for 19 years and who had said almost nothing in any of the introductory meetings, looked at her and said, "Salvatore never told us when he was wrong." "I know," she said. "Is that a policy?" he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. It was the kind of nod that carried weight. The meeting ran 4 hours. At the end of it, there was not unanimous enthusiasm. She had not expected enthusiasm and would not have trusted it. What there was, across 10 faces, was the quality she had been working toward since the farmhouse. Not loyalty given because a dying man had asked for it. Loyalty chosen, provisionally and with clear eyes, because the person in front of them had demonstrated something they could work with. That was enough. It was the only kind that held. 3 months after the night she was thrown into the snow, Isabella De Luca stood at the window of the office that had been her grandfather's and looked out at the city below. The city that Salvatore had watched for 40 years, that he had mapped and understood and built his empire inside, and that was now hers to understand differently. Lucia was behind her in a proper crib, the kind with rails and a mattress that had been measured and tested, in a room that had been painted and furnished with the deliberateness of someone building something permanent. She was sleeping, which she did with the absolute commitment that was still her defining quality, as if sleep were a position she had decided to hold. Vera knocked on the open door and came in with a folder. Operational update, the kind they did weekly now, structured, formal, with written summaries that created a record and accountability on both sides. "The Western Territory," Vera said. "Sit down," Isabella said, turning from the window. They went through it. 20 minutes, methodical, the language of two people who had learned to work together through a specific kind of pressure and had come out the other side with the kind of efficiency that didn't require explanation. When they were done, Vera closed the folder. "Frances called," Vera said. "She's finished the restructuring proposal for the legitimate holdings. She wants to walk you through it." "Wednesday," Isabella said. "Morning." Vera noted it. She stood. She paused at the door. "How are you?" she said. It was not the kind of question Vera usually asked. Isabella looked at her and recognized that it was being asked because Vera had decided it needed to be asked, which meant Vera had been watching and thought she saw something that warranted it. "I'm working," Isabella said. "That's not what I asked." Isabella looked at the window, at the city, at the reflection of the room behind her in the glass, the desk, the chairs, the crib in the far corner where her daughter was sleeping, the shape of a life that had been assembled under conditions that should have made it impossible. "I'm here," she said. It was the most accurate thing she had said in a long time. Vera nodded and went out. Isabella stood at the desk and looked at the operational folder and the weekly schedule and the pending decisions that required her attention. And she thought about the woman who had stood in a snowstorm on the shoulder of a county road 6 months ago with a 3-day-old child and $4,000 and a lawyer's letter she hadn't known what to do with. She thought about that woman, the fear that had been in her, the cold, the specific sound of the gate closing behind her, and she did not try to distance herself from it. It was the ground this was built on. You didn't distance yourself from your ground. She sat down. She opened the folder. Lucia made a small sound from the crib, not crying, the low, exploratory sound she made sometimes when she was moving between sleep states, and Isabella looked over at her for a moment, then looked back at the folder. The work was in front of her. She began.